A sarcastic and lonely young man named Haruka is thrown into another world against his will. Discovered by a group of goblins roasting a pig, the boy is forced to run for his life as the monsters chase after him. At one point, Haruka makes a large leap forward, hoping his plan works. Sure enough, when the goblins reach the spot Haruka had cleverly avoided, they fall into a trap he had dug earlier, tumbling into a hole. At that moment, Haruka is left trying to deal with this new universe he's been dragged into all on his own. Flashing back to the day he was teleported, Haruka was spending his break time as usual. Reading his mail was alone. In other words, not only was he a loner in his original life, but he had to be one in another world too. Haruka had nothing in common with the people in his class. Almost everyone belonged to a group: the delinquents, the popular girls, the otakus, and the class representatives. And the rest? Well, they were just the rest. Yes, there were people like him who didn't fit into any group at all. That's when everything happened. A golden magic circle engulfed the entire classroom, ready to whisk everyone away to that crazy new universe. While everyone else had already gone into a panic, lazy Haruka took a while to even lift his head and notice the magical phenomenon happening around him. But once he did, instead of reacting like his classmates, he felt excited for a second, only to realize another world would probably be a drag after all. So he decided to run away. Or at least he tried, but no matter what he did, he couldn't force open the classroom door, which for some reason was locked. As everyone was being pulled into the teleportation, Haruka still held out hope that he could escape through the ceiling. He finally managed to open the ventilation duct and hoped to slip away, but it seems all his efforts were in vain, as the magic circle spread and eventually caught up with him. Soon enough, he found himself in a classic, all-white limbo-like place, the kind that serves as a gateway to another world. The kind where you probably find a fat king and his hot princess, the kind no mirror would ever stand a chance with in real life. Speaking of which, there was an old man in that place, seemingly looking for Haruka. He didn't speak with sounds. Rather, his words appeared in text bubbles like in a video game. Apparently, he was some sort of god in this world, and Haruka's entire class had already been transported to the new world, except for him. So the boy had to hurry up and decide his stats before he could head down. With that, a large status screen appeared in the limbo. Normally, each person would get 50 points to spend on skills and magic, but since this was the old man's first time dealing with 43 people at once, the overpowered abilities had already been taken, leaving only the worst ones. In other words, even though Haruka had hoped to be a mage or a paladin, he had to settle for items like contact lenses or villager as set. As for weapons, among two-handed swords and deadly bows, he ended up with a staff that was basically just a stick. When it came to magic, his choices were well-being and walking. Frustrated, Haruka complained to the old man, who finally gave in and handed him all the remaining skills before sending the kid on his way. And so, Haruka was finally thrown into an isekai in the middle of a forest with the worst abilities and absolutely no clue how to survive in a place like this. The first thing he saw was his villager a set, but to his surprise, the small bag could hold infinite items, and inside there were things like contact lenses, a cloak, a ring of the dead soul, and a jewel of knowledge. Haruka still thought all these items seemed pretty useless, but after putting on the cloak, he felt a little more connected to this world. He then tried to check his stats, but quickly remembered that in order to do that, he needed to roll 2 dice, which would determine how many points he had to distribute. Far from the 50 he thought he would get. However, for some reason, the dice rolled an M, something he didn't even know the meaning of. Maybe it stood for masculinity, but it wasn't the time to speculate. He needed to assign his points. He didn't care about balancing his build, so he dumped everything into the luck attribute. As the stats were calculated, he realized his luck was incredibly high, leading him to deduce that the M on the dice meant maximum. On the other hand, all his other attributes remained terrible. At least he got an extra skill, Subjugate, which allowed him to make others follow him. But since he was the last one thrown into this world, one of his character conditions was to survive on his own and not be able to form groups. That meant his dream of assembling a party full of girls in this isekai was shattered too. Nevertheless, Haruka decided he needed to find a safe place to stay. But to navigate through the unfamiliar forest, he was definitely going to need the contact lenses from his infinite bag. When he put them on, he had no idea they had the ability of appraisal, allowing him to see the name, category, and usefulness of everything in this world. Surely this skill opened Haruka's eyes to this new reality, making him feel much more aware of what he was doing. With that, he gathered edible mushrooms that increased the user's abilities and stashed them in his infinite bag. At that moment, he apologized for ever dismissing the villager a set, especially after discovering that the bag could also serve as a water bottle. After some more time adventuring, Haruka stumbles upon a cave and decides to explore it, but not without first asking for forgiveness from the monster that may live in this disguised dungeon, even though he prayed it was just an empty cave where he could settle. Taking a glance at his bag, the adventurer had a magical tent and a lantern, so he was halfway to setting up camp there once he ensured the place was vacant. Next, he gathered some branches and leaves to start a fire, using his temperature ability to heat it. As he did this, the ability evolved into fire magic. In addition, he gained clairvoyance, perception, and enemy detection. Despite the pleasant surprise, the sleep that came over him might have caused Haruka to fall asleep in the middle of this hostile land, with only a stick to defend himself. However, the exhaustion was so overwhelming that he had to take the risk, and that's how he survived his first day in this unknown world. The next morning, he woke up safe and sound because the tent and the lantern had abilities that acted as repellents for both insects and monsters, thanks to the recluse title he earned for being the last to arrive in the Isekai. Putting that aside, Haruka felt his stomach growl, so he lit a new fire and tossed the mushrooms and meat he had in his bag over it. With a bit of seasoning to boost the flavor, breakfast was soon ready. To top it off, he hadn't expected to have cooking utensils in his bag, so he imagined this villager A, who had originally owned the equipment, must have been a true survivor of the wilderness. Once he had satisfied his hunger, the adventurer had to decide where to go next, knowing that at least he had a place to stay. The next step was to find spots where he could gather food, as well as improve the security of his shelter. The only issue was the monsters he might encounter along the way. Speaking of which, through his perception ability, he detected 2 goblins, marking his first challenge in this environment. Haruka assessed them to be level 8, which frustrated him even more as he thought these types of monsters would be easy XP for a noob. Nonetheless, he felt the need to learn how to fight as soon as possible, and this might be his chance. So with only a stick in hand, he used his sealing ability, which infused the weapon with magic. He figured that if he couldn't have overpower magic, he would become overpower himself. With that, Haruka charged at the first goblin, striking it on the head with a stick, and as the poor creature spun around like a bug, he finished it off. The second goblin rushed at the human, but Haruka easily dodged the simple, predictable attacks. Finally, he used a bit of his mana to channel energy through the stick and blasted the goblin, finishing the job. After the victory, the boy took a break by the river in the late afternoon. Surviving his first battle filled him with pride. Returning home, Haruka ate his mushrooms and checked out the wooden club he had taken from one of the goblins. However, he found the weapon small, heavy, and useless. Apparently, his stick was enough for now. At least he had leveled up to 2, which was progress. His stats had practically doubled, and he had also leveled up his weapon proficiency skill after pummeling the goblin. Not to mention his sensibility technique, which would prevent him from being caught off guard by goblins who might torment him like a damsel in distress. Additionally, he had gained magic coating after imbuing the staff with magic. Lastly, his calisthenics leveled up because he always stretched when he woke up. At least that's what he did this morning. The next day, Haruka couldn't bear to eat mushrooms anymore and thought about finding new food, but he imagined the class reps wouldn't approve of him wasting food, so he forced himself to swallow it all. Moving past that, he felt much stronger with his level 1 magic coating, as it allowed the user to enhance their physical abilities and magical defense. Surely, every living soul in this world would line up at the market to snag a skill like that. On top of that, his appraisal also leveled up, which made him see question marks at the end of each equipment's name, something that, in his opinion, seemed much worse than before. However, not wanting to stress about it, Haruka set out to finally rid his diet of mushrooms, desperately searching for a decent piece of meat in this godforsaken world. Once he calmed down, he had the idea to use his magic coating, giving him the ability to run and jump with much more force. Not to mention that his attacks had become noticeably faster. With his power, the boy went after more goblins and took out 2. Feeling confident, he thought he could handle 3 at once, but as soon as he came across a trio of monsters, Haruka retreated and headed back home to train a bit more before diving into such a mess. In the following days, he hunted pairs of goblins in the morning and practiced his magic at night. By the 5th day, the adventurer could defeat a goblin in a single blow, and he had even decorated his base with magic, setting up a gate and everything for protection. One day, he finally found a rabbit in the forest and worked hard to catch the little thing so he could eat some meat after such a long time. With the animal in hand, the starving boy could already hear the sound of the pot sizzling, but his perception shifted his focus in another direction. This time, there weren't any monsters around, but rather the delinquents from Haruka's classroom. And it wasn't just them. Using clairvoyance, Haruka discovered that the class princesses, the muscleheads, the otakus, and the class reps were also nearby. Thinking about that last group, Haruka reflected that it might be better to travel as a team. He had known one of the class reps since their first day of school, so perhaps he should just approach them and try a friendly conversation, but he quickly dismissed the idea in favor of his isolation and freedom, where no one could tell him what to do. With that resolve in mind, Haruka decided he would become the lone master of this world. But before that, he needs to hide to avoid being found by the bullies, so he throws himself into the bushes. One of them hears a sound and heads straight toward it, and all Haruka can do is hope the guy doesn't keep going. Luckily for him, a rabbit suddenly dashes out of the underbrush, startling the bully, and they all convince themselves it was just the animal, so they leave. Even though Haruka doesn't want to confront them, he stays close to overhear what they're talking about. Not that they're discussing anything particularly useful, as the apparent leader is reminding the others about the incredible figure of the vice class representative, while the rest of the dimwits start naming their own favorites. Since they're focused on talking about the class reps, Haruka recalls how those girls always manage to handle bullies like these. The leader then pesters Tanaka, a student outside their group, asking if the girls' skills will actually work for whatever they're planning, which makes Haruka think they're using the kid like a Google search. Finally, the leader jokes that the vice rep is waiting for him, and soon after, they all leave for good. With that, Haruka figures the entire class must be upstream, but either way, he knows all too well that solitude is the way to go. The biggest issue is that he hasn't managed to gather anything other than mushrooms, but at least he levels up his loner skill, possibly because he's avoided any interaction with his classmates. Still, he's only at level 3, probably because he hasn't leveled up the Master of None and Ventriloquist skills, which he doesn't even know what they mean. Without wasting time, he tries to make sense of these abilities. Master of None likely means he can't focus on just one thing enough to master it, but at least he can do pretty much everything in a mediocre way. As for Ventriloquist, it seems like a terrible skill, as if it implies he's a puppet in the hands of others. Regardless, he gives up on it for now and decides to eat to clear his head, even if it's just more mushrooms as usual. On the 7th day in the early hours, Haruka is awakened by the sound of metal clashing and some male battle cries, so he assumes it's the delinquents causing trouble again. However, as he approaches the noise, he sees the nerds fighting off a group of goblins, and he can't help but find it amusing, though he wonders if he should help since they don't seem to have the upper hand. Using his evaluation skill, the protagonist checks if these guys need help but realizes they don't. They're all at level 16, and from top to bottom, the first is a sorcerer, then a saint, a guardian, and a shinobi. Clearly, they didn't get stuck with useless skills like him, which is why they're doing so well. This reminds Haruka of his class, which had plenty of athletes and promising students, the cream of the crop. Thinking about it, he still doesn't understand how he ended up with them. As for the otaku nerds, they must have watched enough isekai to know how to handle a situation like this. So Haruka turns to leave, but his perception skill picks up on 2 goblins sneaking up on the nerds from behind. Instantly, the lone protagonist remembers how those guys were always nice to him. So Haruka steps in and takes out the 2 enemies. Afterward, he greets the group. Soon, they're all walking together, and the guys thank the loner for his help, but Haruka has been out of touch with friendship for so long that he's forgotten how to act in social situations, leaving him unsure how to respond to their gratitude. He leads the group to his cave, and they're all impressed by the place's architecture and decor, especially considering he built it all on his own. Striking up a conversation, Haruka asks what happened to the rest of the class and what they were doing in the forest at that hour. The nerds have trouble answering, so the sorcerer explains that they were running away. Starting from the beginning, everything began when they were all teleported into the forest. Some scratched their heads, others pinched themselves thinking it was a dream, while some cried like babies. However, the nerds were the most comfortable in this isekai world, which led the bullies to demand they explain everything about such worlds, or else heads would roll. Amidst the widespread panic, the class rep called for calm, but as soon as a horde of goblins appeared, no one could handle the situation. Not even the cocky delinquents could withstand the hostile creatures and retreated in the face of danger. The exception, once again, was the nerds. The guardian with his shield, the shinobi with his katana, the saint with his hammer, and the sorcerer with his spells. All of them charged at the goblins. Even the bullies and athletes joined the fight in the end, and the threat was eliminated. After their victory, the class rep suggested they find a safe place to stay, leading the group to the riverbank. Once there, the nerds used their isekai knowledge to develop survival strategies and set up a camp. The class reps divided the duties, assigning tasks like keeping watch, cooking, and gathering supplies. Thanks to this, the entire class managed to work together, or so it seemed. One day, however, the popular girls complained about having to gather firewood and refused to cooperate. Soon, others joined in, and before long, the leader had lost almost all the group members. Only the class reps, the nerds, and a few others remained at the camp, though some were still unmotivated and bored with the routine, so they slacked off. Then, a goblin attack hit the base, and the nerds, already overwhelmed with work, had to face the enemies alone. They'd won, but the price was exhaustion. Even so, the nerd sorcerer understood the challenge they faced. If they wanted to survive, they had to stick together and level up. After all, the goblins weren't the only threat. The bullies were too, because the sorcerer had seen them forcing another student to pass skills to them, like charm, which probably grants control over people, and puppeteer, which also suggests control over supposed puppets. In other words, the nerds weren't just leveling up to face external enemies, but the ones inside the camp as well. To keep an eye on the troublemakers, the Abtakas followed them deep into the forest and overheard a plan to establish a harem at the camp. They quickly rushed back to warn the class representative, who decided to level up as well, preparing to face the bullies head-on. However, the bullies had recently learned how to use charm and puppeteer abilities, making the challenge far from simple. Regardless, with great courage, the class rep confronted the rivals like a lamb to the slaughter. But contrary to expectations, all the bullies were swiftly taken down, left unable to move. Without wasting time, the nerds used magic to seal away the delinquents' sinister abilities, and with their harem plans exposed, the bullies were forced to flee from the camp. However, it was clear they wouldn't let this slide easily, and they soon returned for revenge. Things quickly spiraled out of control, with tents ablaze and panic spreading throughout the area. As if that wasn't enough, the attackers vowed to come back. In the end, the camp was reduced to ashes, and the popular girls blamed the nerds for the disaster, accusing them of starting a fight with the bullies. The rest of the students jumped on the bandwagon and also blamed the Abtakas. The class representative, along with a few others who didn't think the nerds were at fault, tried to defend them, but it wasn't enough. Consequently, the nerds were expelled from the camp as well. Upon hearing this story, Haruka was nearly moved to tears and hugged his comrades for the ordeal they had gone through. He even offered them a mushroom party to gossip and fill their stomachs. In the end, Haruka spent the night with his friends, realizing that having company isn't always a bad thing. As dawn broke, he bid farewell to his classmates, and Oda asked if Haruka would join them as they were planning to follow the river in search of a city to become adventurers. The loner admitted that there was no one else in this isekai with whom he'd want to team up, but in his usual mysterious way, he declined the offer and told the boys to leave. Watching the nerds walk away, Haruka reflected that his weak skills would only slow them down. Setting that aside, he decided to track down the class reps to get to the bottom of the situation. During his search, he encountered a kobold, got bitten, but managed to defeat the creature by hitting it on the head. As he continued his trek, he reached his class's destroyed campsite at nightfall. His enemy detection ability revealed human footprints crossing the river, so he followed the tracks and spotted the popular girls in the distance. He figured it would have been better to stay home and feast on roasted mushrooms. That was exactly what he was about to do when suddenly the most popular girls in the class confronted him. Haruka ran off, but when he heard one of them say, "Please stop," he decided to see if that was really what she had said. The popular girl quickly explained that they were looking for the nerds to apologize, as they had just realized the gravity of their mistake. After all, they were only alive because of them. Haruka found it strange that these pampered girls would want to apologize to anyone, since that would never happen in the original world. But he informed them that catching up to the nerds at this point was impossible. Still, one of the girls asked him to share what he knew, so Haruka responded with some tough questions of his own. Could they get out of the forest? Could they face monsters? Were they really going to find their saviors and apologize, or would they give up? Faced with his harsh words, the girls started crying like children, afraid they'd die in the endless forest. They begged Haruka to teach them everything he knew so they could survive and make amends for the mistake of banishing the nerds from the camp. After all this, Haruka noticed that his subjugation ability had been activated in the system, with the three girls listed as subjugated: the popular leader, popular girl A, and popular girl B. In other words, whether he liked it or not, he was now tied to them on this journey by the force of fate. And so, as the sun began to rise after hours of walking, the three girls followed him like baby ducklings trailing their mother. Haruka was losing his mind over their clueless behavior, especially the vacant look in their eyes. Fearing the moment when things would escalate, when they'd start slaughtering kobolds without hesitation and delivering their crystals like dogs returning a toy to their owner. At least that's how he imagined the subjugation ability worked. In the midst of these desperate thoughts, Haruka noticed one of the girls was injured, so he offered her a healing potion. But instead of using it properly, she poured the entire potion over Haruka, thinking that was the command. At that moment, he realized that if the class rep found out what had become of these girls, she'd definitely lose it, and there was no way he could face her with her class leader powers. Just as Haruka was contemplating how to undo the subjugation spell, the class representative appeared behind him, shouting to get his attention. Meanwhile, the bullies were plotting to go after the girls who were still lingering around the old campsite. But first, they had other problems to deal with. Returning to the protagonist, he tries to call the class representative by her name, but he simply can't remember it. This, of course, deeply irritates the girl, who makes sure to express her annoyance loudly and clearly. Shortly after, the other class reps catch up, clearly out of breath. The leader asks what happened to the preppy girls, as they don't seem to be in great shape, but truthfully, even Haruka would love an explanation. It looks like his subjugation skill has left the girls looking like zombies. Realizing what's going on, the class rep asks if Haruka used the subjugation skill on the preppy girls, and he nods somewhat reluctantly. She gets upset because that type of ability is only meant to be used on monsters, forcing Haruka to explain that it sort of happened by accident. After hearing that, all the girls give him a suspicious look, doubting his accidental explanation, and for a moment, Haruka almost turns into a block of ice under their cold, calculating stares. With some effort, he manages to wriggle out of the situation and tries to leave, but the girls insist that he stop right there. Frustrated, Haruka can't believe that this is the solitary life he was promised in this new world. The leader of the reps shakes Shimazaki, the head of the preppy girls, trying to see if she's okay. After some persistence, Shimazaki's eyes return to normal, and the class rep calls Haruka back to gather all the girls and discuss what's going on. At least now, Haruka is left alone, just as he wanted from the start. So he thinks about practicing his house expansion skill while he waits. Maybe he could even build a base or something like that. With this goal in mind, he gathers mana into his hands to activate the skill, but instead of doing what he expected, the boy is tragically buried in the ground, leaving only his neck above the surface. Naturally, the class rep has to dig him out so he can explain everything Shimazaki had told her. According to Shimazaki, Haruka had come to help them all, which makes the girls bow down to thank this merciful man for his assistance. That said, Haruka asks to go home, only to be scolded by the girls, who demand the help he had promised. The class rep wonders what he meant by going home, so Haruka explains that he has a house, one he built with his own hands after being thrown into this world. The girls are thrilled by this revelation, and the leader quickly calls for a new strategy meeting, leaving Haruka on the sidelines once again. The class rep asks how many people can fit in his house, to which Haruka responds that if you squeeze 6 people into a space the size of a tatami mat, you could fit about 240, even more if you move the furniture around and people don't mind crowding into the bathroom and kitchen. Hearing this, the girls are fascinated that his house even has such rooms, while the leader is shocked that he's living in a mansion in the middle of nowhere just like that. Regardless, the girls encourage their leader to make the requests, so she does, politely asking if she and her friends could stay at Haruka's house, at least for the night. As soon as she finishes her sentence, Haruka can barely believe that this huge group of high school girls is about to stay at his place, and the thought messes with his head in a way that makes it impossible to refuse. Without delay, he leads them all to his home, using his location skill to guide him through the dark night. Finally, after a long walk, the girls are huffing from exhaustion, unable to keep up with the brisk pace set by their host. He warmly welcomes them to his humble abode. Once they catch their breath and realize where they are, it becomes clear. They've arrived at a mansion in the middle of nowhere. This discovery excites the group of girls more than anything else they've experienced in this hostile new world. Somehow, Haruka finds it strange that the girls like his house even more than the nerds did, but now it's time to show them where everything is. As he points out the bathroom, most of the girls rush ahead to take a bath, throwing their clothes in the air as they go, leaving Haruka staring at a scene of dozens of girls bathing together. He realizes that all this time the forest has turned these girls into wild creatures. And since the place is now full of people, Haruka finds his own corner by setting up a tent outside. However, just as he's celebrating his solitude, he's interrupted by the leader of the class reps, who wants to thank him for all the support he's given. After the boys left, the girls were incredibly anxious, but now they're much calmer. It's amazing what a fancy room, some good food, and a warm bath can do for the human soul. Despite this, the leader admits that she doesn't feel like she's led her group well through all the terror they've endured. Haruka reassures her, saying that she's protected them tonight, but she replies that unfortunately, she can't do what Oda and the others can. To that, Haruka tells her that she doesn't need to. The nerds were practically made for this kind of environment, and they came here knowing exactly how to act. They're the aliens in this world for that reason. The rest of them have no idea how to survive here, so she shouldn't compare herself to them. This makes her feel a bit better, but she's still curious about one thing. If Haruka can build a mansion in the middle of nowhere, maybe he's the real alien in this story. Haruka is taken aback by her sharp perception. She bids him goodnight and heads off. After a long while, the girls finally get a chance to take a good bath and sleep in a proper bed, resting like babies in this unexpected mansion. Haruka, on the other hand, gets the least comfortable spot, but just being quiet in his own corner is enough. Along with his thoughts about shirt-clad girls, the perverted boy imagines this is going to be a long night. When dawn breaks again, a girl apologizes for waking Haruka up but informs him that breakfast is ready. He wakes up startled, having no idea who this person inside his tent is, and asks if he can sleep for just half an hour more before getting up. The girl crawls closer and teases that it looks like he has no intention of getting up at all. Feeling a bit awkward, Haruka tries to change the mood by asking what's on the menu for breakfast. She tells him there are mushrooms and grilled fish, which gets him excited, considering he spent all these days eating nothing but mushrooms. Without meaning to, he accidentally headbutts the girl. As they step out of the tent, the girl tries to recover from the hit, while Haruka, not one to miss an opportunity, skips the apologies and goes straight for the fish. With the first bite, his newfound love for the fish became stronger than anything else. The girl, representing her group, asks if Haruka hasn't been living near a stream, to which he replies that he has, but he's only been eating mushrooms and watching the fish swim by because they're too fast and clever to catch easily. Curious, he asks if the girls have an easier way to catch the fish, and they proceed to show him their technique, which makes the job much simpler. At the riverbank, one of the girls uses an electric power that instantly kills the fish. Fascinated, Haruka asks her to do it again. When she gathers electricity in her hands, Haruka uses his packaging skill to capture the spell and then uses it on the river with his own hands. Delighted, he celebrates having caught fish for the first time, and on top of that, he's developed his own electric magic. Apparently, with his packaging ability, he can capture any elemental magic and reproduce it in his own way. The girl comments that this seems a bit overpowered, to which Haruka adds that it appears to be a combination of the packaging skill and his Master of None ability. Still, he recalls that he was left with the worst powers while everyone else got the best ones, and controlling that electric magic almost made him wet his pants with excitement. Later, Haruka meets with the leader of the girls and asks if she's decided what to do next. She explains that they haven't reached a consensus yet, but it seems like everyone is heading to the city. Haruka imagines the girls are trying to catch up with the nerds, and they confirm that they need to apologize. The leader emphasizes that it would be important to gain a few levels before embarking on this journey, which Haruka agrees with. Since that's the plan, he'd like to help. The leader thanks him but clarifies that their goal isn't to chase after Oda and the other nerds. Haruka expresses disappointment, as he would have loved to see a showdown between the girls and the nerds with their strong abilities. Regardless, he gathers with all of them to begin their training journey. First, he asks what level each of them is at, and the ones at the front show they're between levels 16 and 21. Haruka is shocked that the lowest level shown is so high, considering he's only at level 7. But keeping his word, he quickly spots 3 kobolds lazing about in a nearby bush and asks the girls to take care of them since those monsters are only half their level. The girls start stretching and preparing for battle, but when the time comes, they are completely defeated. Haruka complains that it was pathetic, and the girls grumble that no one warned them the creatures would bite. A little later, instead of enjoying the peace and quiet in the tent he set up, poor Haruka watches as several girls gather inside for a review of the fight instead of being anywhere else. Before long, they leave the tent with their confidence restored, except for the purple-haired girl who woke Haruka earlier. She stays behind to apologize, explaining that she was just testing him earlier. When the boys attacked, she was almost caught and was left traumatized. That's why she wanted to see if Haruka would harm them, but he proved just the opposite. She adds that she'll wake him up again tomorrow for breakfast. And so the next morning, Haruka starts his day with fish while the girls train for their rematch with the kobolds. After training, some of them are too exhausted to even stand, while others pretend to be sick to avoid combat. Nevertheless, those who push through manage to defeat the trio of kobolds. After their victory, they greet the fallen creatures and begin to think of them as pet dogs. The group leader then informs Haruka that they're ready to head to the city with him, but he never said he was going along. Later, when everything is set, the girls finally depart. Haruka warns the leader that they have no way of knowing what lies ahead, so they need to stay sharp and keep their wits about them. That night, in the pouring rain, a student runs frantically, trying to escape someone chasing him. After stumbling over a rock, he falls hard to the ground and is soon caught. He screams that he doesn't have the ability the man is looking for, but the pursuer ignores him and attacks. The next day, Haruka leads the group through the forest, always mindful that the bullies could be lurking anywhere, watching them. That's why the leader needs to ensure everyone's safety, and for that to happen, the best course of action is to get out of there as soon as possible and reach the city. However, it wasn't just the delinquents that could pose a problem during this journey, because the forest itself held dangers that weren't easy to overcome. For instance, a massive orc suddenly blocks the group's path. Haruka immediately tells everyone to back off and watch closely as he takes on the monster alone, demonstrating the moves they should learn. As the human charges toward it, the orc swings its club at him but misses its target. Haruka uses that dodge to gauge the orc's speed. According to what the nerds had said, this race had great resistance to physical attacks, and the only way they had ever defeated such a creature was through magic. With that in mind, the lone hero opens his menu, searching for a spell that might be effective. Among them, he finds 4 elements, the classic elements of fire, water, earth, and air. Haruka had learned this ability after using packing in so many ways, like cleaning the floors in his own house, for example. In the end, even seemingly useless techniques could come in handy, and Haruka was becoming a master at turning them to his advantage. In any case, Haruka wasn't completely alone in this fight, so the orc resumes its attack, smashing a tree where Haruka had taken cover with its enormous club. The next few swings come dangerously close to the human, and before he ends up as mincemeat, Haruka quickly circles around the orc and whacks it with a stick, causing the poor creature to cry out and collapse to the ground. With this victory, Haruka becomes thoughtful, having just said that orcs are resistant to physical attacks, yet he just defeated one with a mere stick. Even the girls come closer to try to make sense of what just happened, especially since they hadn't learned anything from that bizarre performance. But since even Haruka couldn't explain what was going on, he promises to fight properly next time and rely on magic. Speaking of next time, the group soon encounters another orc further along the path. This time, Haruka decides to test his fire magic against it. He hurls a fireball at the creature and wins the battle, leaving everyone confused once again at how easily he's handling these fights. Besides, just like before, the girls weren't able to learn anything from the combat because this guy was just too overpowered to solve things like normal people. However, by nightfall, the girls weren't as angry as they had been earlier, since each of them now had a portion of roasted meat ready to be devoured as they relaxed at an improvised campsite for the night. A little way off, Haruka sets up his trap using earth magic to keep enemies at bay, in this case, an extremely deep pit. His magical tents not only have a monster repellent feature but can also detect presences, so the girls would be completely safe. With that taken care of, it was time to plot the next day's route using a map he had learned to summon with his evaluation skill. While observing the river's location, he's suddenly alerted to the presence of enemies in the area, so he rushes to check the situation. From a distance, he spots some male figures and assumes they're the bullies, making him break out in a cold sweat, but it turns out they're just the athletes, who approach Haruka in a friendly manner. Haruka wants to know what they're up to, assuming they're after something or someone in the woods. Offended, the athletes explain that they're not here for any girl, but for Haruka himself. As for the girls, they feel they can't trust anyone else in the class. Setting that aside, the athlete's leader informs him that there's a skill roaming the forest that's even more dangerous than marionette or hypnosis. Haruka wonders what kind of magic could be more troublesome than those two and recalls the skill called abduction. The athlete confirms that it's exactly that, and it's not the delinquents who have it, as one might expect, but someone from outside. At this, Haruka extends his hand threateningly and calls the boys idiots because they hadn't considered that he himself might possess that skill. However, if that's the case, the athletes agree it's 1,000 times better for it to be in his hands than the bullies, but they still want to know if the loner really knows how to cast that spell. Embarrassed, Haruka explains that, in fact, he can only use the magic of servitude, something the athletes have no clue about, but since it's in Haruka's hands, they trust that nothing too bad can happen, assuming the kid probably won't use it for anything very useful. Slightly offended by this statement, Haruka warns them not to mess with loners, but the athletes aren't looking for any trouble. In reality, they only came to warn the group to be careful with the abduction skill, and they'll keep an eye on the bullies lurking in the forest. Finally, they ask Haruka to apologize to the girls on their behalf for all the drama that went down at the class camp. With that, the boys bid farewell and leave while the class representative, who had been eavesdropping on the entire conversation, listened quietly. When morning arrives on the 17th, Haruka rallies the team to continue their trek, and for some unknown reason, the girls seem more cheerful than usual, leaving Haruka deep in thought. As he moves away from the group, the class representative approaches him to talk about the conversation he had with Kazikaze's group. Haruka explains that they apologize for everything that happened, but that's not what the girl wants to discuss. In fact, she's the one who apologizes to Haruka in advance, taking a long time to bring up the subject because it's such a heavy topic. Haruka quickly realizes that she's the one with the abduction skill, and this surprises her as she had asked Oda's group to keep that a secret. But now that Haruka knows, she wants to understand why he helped her even knowing this instead of being afraid. Haruka doesn't understand why she should be afraid, so she explains that this skill allows you to steal the target's ability after you take their life, making it the most overpowered and sinister technique of all. It's undoubtedly terrifying. Regarding this, Haruka points out that the nerds weren't scared either, and they seal off the puppet and hypnosis skills of the bullies but left the class rep with the kidnapping skill. This means they believe only she should carry that power. The class rep is moved to tears by this and says Haruka is to blame for her crying so much, leading him to run away while defending himself from the accusation. However, the truth is that she's grateful for everything he's done. Later, the group resumes their journey toward the river. Haruka, having reached the spot he wanted, takes the opportunity to test something he had in mind. Without a second thought, he dashes off in a certain direction and activates his magic infusion. He then uses the magic weight skill to lighten his magic, allowing him to take an enormous leap into the air, jumping from branch to branch until he reaches an incredible height. Obviously, he still hasn't learned how to fly, no matter how much he's tried, so he crashes to the ground, nearly losing all his HP. Without a doubt, he would have died if not for his magic infusion, but at least he figured out the path he needs to follow by playing bird for a few seconds. Later, still a bit out of it from the huge fall, Haruka tries to explain to the class rep how he returned to the escort all battered up but fails miserably. Regardless, at dawn they set off again, this time using a much quicker route. Along the way, all sorts of things happen, like the girls from the class taking a group bath and a trio of orcs chasing everyone at one point. But no matter what, the team stays strong and united as they head toward their destination. And after the storm, the calm finally arrives. In other words, they find the exit to the forest and the girls cheer. On the other hand, Haruka remains cautious, unsure of what might be lurking in the hills. Checking his menu, he discovers that he learned the skill Airwalk thanks to his little performance from the previous day. Without delay, he tests the technique to see how it works, scanning the area to ensure it's safe before continuing the journey with the girls. As he looks around, he spots a group of locals in trouble. However, just because they're being attacked by monsters doesn't mean they're good people, so Haruka considers not helping them. On the other hand, the girls vote to rescue those people, and the class rep commits to fighting that group if they turn out to be bandits. Knowing she'd act that way, Haruka decides to go alone to avoid putting his companions at risk. To reach the group in danger, he repeats the magic he used the day before to run higher, but this time he adds a small tornado using the wind element to boost his speed. The problem is that the tornado ends up pulling the class rep along with him, and she desperately grabs onto his cloak to avoid becoming a pancake on the ground. But as if that weren't enough, the two realize they won't be able to stop their flight as planned, so they crash near the attacked group's carriage like a meteor. After the dust settles, the native men are left bewildered, though Haruka managed to take down the monsters surrounding them as well as apparently the class rep herself. Soon, the leader of the group, a man with black hair, introduces himself as Ofter, and another man says his name is Gaitek. Haruka wants to know why they were attacked, and Ofter explains that merchants were ambushed by a pack of great green wolves. So the guild put a bounty on the monsters' heads. The group thought they could make some money off it, but from what Haruka could see, they were totally wrong. Regardless, there's no use crying over spilled milk, so Ofter asks everyone to collect what's left of the spoils. Haruka roasts a mushroom for Gatek after the battle, and the local excitedly remarks that they're buff shrooms, mushrooms that provide buffs and are extremely valuable. Surprised by this, Haruka serves the rest of the group, and soon the girls start feeling as good as new. Watching this for some reason, Haruka begins to feel uneasy about these two men being in a group with such beautiful girls. Shortly after, the rest of the group catches up to Haruka, and the girls are delighted to meet an elf for the first time in their lives. Then they're guided by the locals to the much-anticipated city called Omu. To mark the unique moment, the group draws a line in the dirt to represent the finish line of a new life, and they leap over it, jumping toward the future. Meanwhile, the bullies continue leveling up in the forest, searching for the girls for the long-awaited showdown. A boy who had been captured by them advises the delinquents to break the seal placed on the puppet and hypnosis skills, but the problem is that to do so, they first need someone with the sealing skill. In other words, the bullies need to find the nerds who possess that technique before they can exact revenge on everyone. Strangely, as this conversation takes place, the boy accompanying the delinquents lets out a sinister laugh. At the same time, the athletes watch the enemies from afar, realizing that nothing good will come of this. Returning to the city of Onmui, the group members are enchanted by its beauty and liveliness. Finally realizing they are truly in another world, everyone is happy, except for Haruka, who doesn't feel this place is quite right for a loner like him. The girls are thrilled by the unique clothing stores and convenient shops filled with items they've never seen before. However, despite the initial excitement, the class representative reminds them there's something important they need to take care of. Seeing her rush off to fulfill her task, Haruka at least finds some comfort in knowing he brought everyone here safely, assuming his mission is now complete. Around the city, two girls remark that the buildings look like cupcakes and wonder if they could eat the houses. The representative has to be the voice of reason, reminding them that stones aren't exactly good for digestion. Struggling to keep up with the group's overwhelming enthusiasm, she asks Haruka for help, but he's already taking the opportunity to relax in the shade with a drink. Immediately, the class rep scolds him, acknowledging that he's just completed his mission, but insists that relaxing in an unfamiliar place is pushing it too far. In response, she blows a whistle, ordering all the girls to line up and salute. Once they do, she announces what needs to happen next. First of all, they need to head to the Adventurers Guild to sell off the junk they've collected so far and register as adventurers. After that, they'll need to find a place to stay for the night. The next day, they'll ask around about Oda's group. Upon hearing this, Shimazaki, the leader of the popular girls, asks why Oda's group is being pushed down the list of priorities. The rep, feeling cornered, explains that wasn't her intention. Haruka seizes the moment to tease that Shimazaki is really worried about the nerds, but she denies it, embarrassed to admit the truth. Either way, they finally head to the Adventurers Guild, and Haruka feels intimidated just by the exterior of the building. Inside, it gets even worse, as the place is filled with rough-looking characters who stare at the newcomers. After, one of the men in the guild approaches Haruka and informs him that the guild master wants to see him. Haruka quickly asks the rep to handle the registration while he deals with this problem. Nervous about all the eyes on him, Haruka heads toward Gatek, the guild's master. With a menacing appearance, Gatek asks if the boy in front of him is Haruka. Trembling, Haruka confirms. But to his surprise, the master stands up and politely thanks him for saving After's group, relieving Haruka, who had feared something much worse was about to happen. Feeling calmer now, Haruka wanders through the guild and finds the place where he can sell his magic stones. He heads to the counter, where a woman explains she'll assess the item's worth. Wasting no time, Haruka dumps dozens of stones on the counter, but the staff member warns him that it's impossible to calculate such a large amount at once, and he'll need to wait until tomorrow for all the items to be evaluated. At this point, the girls inform Haruka that they've all registered as adventurers. Both After and Gatek admit they underestimated the girls, never expecting them to be above level 30. Speaking of which, Shimazaki nudges Haruka to register as well, and for once is excited to finally belong to an official group in this new world. Seeing her friend's enthusiasm, the class rep comments to After and Gatek that Haruka is bound to become an excellent adventurer, since it was thanks to him that they all made it safely to the city. Haruka begins his registration but quickly learns he needs to be at least level 10. Since he's only level 9, he drops to his knees in despair, begging for an exception. But the staff member doesn't budge, further informing him that he also needs to be part of a group and can only proceed solo as an apprentice at level 20. Once he reaches level 30, he'll finally be recognized as a true adventurer. Devastated by this news, Haruka reflects that level 20 is still a long way off, and thanks to his loner skill, he can't officially join any group. Watching the scene unfold, the rep sees how shaken her friend is and takes responsibility for finding lodging for everyone that night. So by the evening, she leads the team to the hotel recommended by the guild. But Haruka isn't too pleased with the strange look of the place. As they enter, a young receptionist welcomes them with open arms, mentioning that the guild had informed her about the new arrivals. Noticing the hearts on each door, Haruka wonders if this is some sort of roadside love hotel, to which the rep tells him to pipe down. Later, he realizes there's nothing particularly odd about the rooms and even feels comfortable in the bed, though he admits to himself that he misses the forest. At the same time, Shimazaki wonders where Oda and the other boys are at this moment. When morning arrives on day 19 since the class arrived in this world, everyone is having breakfast when the rep announces that the city is relatively safe and has all kinds of shops. Seeing the girls' happiness, Haruka senses that they'll do well here while he plans to return to the forest once he sells his magic stones. Speaking of which, when he returns to the guild and sees the offer they made for his stones, the staff member tosses a bag of money onto the counter, apologizing that it's all they can offer for now. Haruka tells her to calm down as the guild master steps in to reinforce that they haven't even finished counting all the stones yet. As Haruka can see, they don't have enough money to pay for all of them at once, so they offer to pay him in installments. When Haruka accepts the offer, the master sets aside 8 million heals as the first payment, and Haruka reflects that if he's not mistaken, this money is worth almost the same as Japanese currency, which means he now holds just over $52,000. Next, the guild worker explains the market values in this world. In Haruka's case, he had enough F-rank magic stones to total 8 million heals, not to mention the bonus he earned from the Green Wolf mission they completed while saving After's group. With that money in hand, the class representative announces it's time to buy essential items. Gatek chimes in, saying he knows a great place where they can spend all that money, and Haruka starts thinking about the kind of place he loved to visit, undoubtedly filled with women. Foolishly, he heads to Gatek with that thought in mind, though he suspects it might be a bit early for such an event. Shortly after, they arrive at the place Gatek mentioned, a shop filled with items directly taken from dungeons. While the shop owner might seem a bit odd, he turns out to be a good guy. Right away, Haruka tests the invisibility cloak, the power gloves, the fire staff, and the mana-cutting sword. Completely smitten with everything, he comes across a necklace called 7 Shops, and the shopkeeper explains that this accessory allows you to fuse the effects of 7 other pieces of equipment into it. Even more obsessed with this item, Haruka is interrupted by the class rep, who orders him to return to the hotel immediately because it's time for bed. Frustrated, the lone wolf asks if he can at least test one more item, the mistletoe twig, which strengthens magical staffs and rods. However, as he grabs the object, he accidentally activates it and fuses all the equipment without even having paid for the magical necklace. The shop owner is furious and informs him that the item is worth over 10 million heals, so Gaytech and the class rep try to persuade the shopkeeper to sell it at a discount given the situation. By the 20th, Haruka was completely broke due to his mishap, even though there was still so much he wanted to buy. Fortunately, the shopkeeper reduced the price of the item to 8 million, but now the kid is flat broke again. And now, even if he wants to gather more magic stones to sell, outsiders can't leave the city without first becoming adventurers and obtaining a permit. And if he tries to sneak out with the girls, the class rep definitely won't allow it. Faced with this, Haruka concludes that city life isn't for him, and he needs to find a way back to the forest. At least now he has the invisibility cloak fused with his peasant set A, which will be incredibly useful. With it, Haruka sneaks past all the girls from his class and makes his way to the city wall. But just as he's about to leap over and escape, a few girls from the class call out to him, causing him to crash into the wall. Putting that aside for now, he and the girls witness one of their group members almost stripping in public to test out a new outfit, so Haruka rushes to stop her from causing a scene. In the end, his first escape plan was a failure. On the 21st, the girls prepare to go on their first mission. Haruka asks to join them, but the class rep shuts him down after his attempt to flee the previous day. Still, after their departure, the lone wolf sneaks past the gate guard with his invisibility cloak and makes it to the outside. Overjoyed, he sprints back to the forest, ignoring every obstacle in his way, including a group of bandits attacking a carriage with a defenseless girl inside. However, the bandits attack him, not wanting to leave any witnesses, forcing Haruka to fight. So he summons his fire bullet to take care of the situation and return to the forest. With that, he takes down all the thugs and realizes that his wooden staff has evolved into a cane, becoming much stronger, all thanks to the mistletoe twig he activated in that shop, or maybe the fire staff he fused also had an effect. Soon after, the bandits rise again and discover their opponent is merely a level 9 boy, so they prepare to use weapon skills, techniques that only those at level 20 and above can wield. The first uses slash, the second uses double, and the third strikes with dash. Haruka notices that these are powerful skills, but the thugs have no idea how to use them properly, so they end up exhausting themselves and losing on their own. With this, the lone wolf realizes that while weapon skills are potent, these enemies were still weak and couldn't handle their own abilities. Then the girl from the carriage thanks the stranger who saved her. She introduces herself as Marielle, a noble with such an odd personality that even Haruka can't quite understand her behavior. She explains that she's the daughter of a local lord and asks the young man to accompany her for the rest of her journey, as she doesn't feel safe after the attack. Of course, she's more than willing to show her gratitude for his help. Though Haruka was eager to return to the forest, that last part convinced him to stay and assist. Inside the carriage, Marielle asks which city Haruka came from. So he explains that he came from a horrible place with a lousy guild where they don't even let visitors leave whenever they want. Because of this and other reasons, the boy is certain the lord of that city is as awful as the place he governs. Upon hearing this, Marielle starts crying as she's the daughter of the lord of the city Haruka just insulted. Oh, and by the way, this carriage is headed back to Omu. Upon realizing this, Haruka panics and tries to get out, but the noble insists she needs to reward him for saving her. Meanwhile, the athletes and the bullies clash in the forest, but the leader of the athletes is pierced by an enemy's blade. In the wake of their first ally's fall, the group realized the situation was more serious than they had anticipated. However, the blade that pierced the boy did not belong to the bullies but to an independent figure who seemed to be on the battlefield autonomously. This swordsman swiftly dispatched the next bully, who attacked him by driving his sword into the opponent's torso and downing another. Yet the bullies persisted in their assault, driven by rage at seeing their companions fall so easily. As expected, the mysterious swordsman quickly cut down the remaining 2 bullies in the blink of an eye. Faced with this reality, the athletes desperately ran for their lives. In the end, the swordsman circled to the front of his adversaries, showing that no one could escape unless he allowed it. Turning back to Haruka, he was still desperate about returning to Omu, the last place he wanted to be right now. Marielle made a pitiful face and asked if he really needed to make such a drama about it. The young man replied that it wasn't fair to make puppy dog eyes to get what she wanted, because now he couldn't say no. Thus, he reached the lord of Omu's mansion, a house so large it made him nervous. Looking at a painting, he wondered if it depicted the lord and his wife. Although they seemed very happy together, all he wanted was to leave as soon as possible. But just as he sneaked towards the nearest door, Marielle appeared again to question what was happening, annoying that he didn't wait for her to change as she had asked. Haruka lied, saying he was just going to wait outside, but she had already guessed that he was trying to escape and made a point of throwing it in his face. As Haruka continued to pretend that was not the case, Mariel lost patience and asserted that she would see the warrior rewarded one way or another, so he should stay where he was. Later, to prove she wasn't lying, the noble dragged the guest to a real feast spread on the table, and he gave up the idea of leaving to indulge in the food. Afterwards, Mariel asked one of the maids to bring the cash reward for having been saved. Moreover, knowing the hero had no form of identity in these lands, she handed him an Onwi identity card, which would allow him to come and go from the city whenever he wanted. In return, of course, the noble only expected that the man would at least remember the name of this town from now on. However, Haruka was far from concerned about this. Rather, he was more focused on the consistency of the pudding he would eat. Embarrassed, Mariel commented softly that she had dressed up for him to act this way. On the 22nd, he had to return to the inn where his group was, so he explained that he hadn't tried to escape at all, but it happens that the city lord had invited him to his mansion. Suspicious, the girls wanted to know why the team member was invited there, so Haruka pretended he didn't know why. At that moment, some of the girls dropped the subject and went on a mission, leaving Haruka hopeful that the others would also forget the whole thing and leave, but before going, the class representative insisted that the young man could not leave the city. Cynical and carefree, Haruka affirmed once again that he understood. With that, the women left, leaving him alone again. Wasting no time, he flashed a mischievous smile and prepared for a new escape attempt with his invisibility cloak. But this time, he had the trump card that would ensure everything went right: his identity earned from the Lord's daughter. Thus, he dashed the gate of Onyu, but before he left, he thought it would be good to buy some items with the money he had won from Mariel, in addition to eating all kinds of food that were not mushrooms. Lastly, he felt he should leave a letter for the class representative, preferably something that wouldn't upset her further. In this case, he simply made it clear that he was going to check on the athletes in the forest, and while he was away, asked the girls to continue leveling up. With everything ready, he finally headed to the exit where a burly soldier guarded the passage. Without delay, Haruka showed his new identity and secured his freedom after having been unnecessarily confined in Onyu. This time, if there was any carriage being attacked along the way, he would pretend he didn't see it and keep moving. Sometime later, he arrived at his beloved forest where the old mushrooms grew in the underbrush and the fish swam in the river and the usual monsters lurked. Observing all these elements, Haruka felt at home once again. However, speaking of home, it was his cave that he could not wait to reach, so he resumed his run to his beloved residence. On the way, a huge orc attempted to attack the lone one but was easily defeated. Thinking about it, Haruka realized it was strange for such a creature to be in this part of the forest, as this race usually resides in the deeper parts of the forest. Nevertheless, he discovered that the items he had bought in Onui were indeed very useful in the woods because he took down that opponent without any difficulty. Despite his confidence in his equipment, as the sun began to set on the horizon, the lone one realized something was wrong with this place, especially when at a certain point on the path he found a bloodstain spread on a rock. He guessed it wasn't the blood of the nerds because they were anicaps professionals, so he assumed it was from the athletes. Soon he spotted footprints ahead and noticed a large trail of blood accompanying the path. Without delay, he ran in that direction and came upon the athletes severely injured on a rock. Seeing that they were alive, he threw several healing potions made from mushrooms in an attempt to save the group. Having done this, the leader of the athletes recovered enough to see that it was Haruka and asked if the girls were safe. Haruka replied that they were fine in the city, all thanks to the athletes. With that, Kazakazi was glad to think he had helped the class. Then the lone one completed that they were the best athletes the class could need. With the fall of night, the protagonist learns that all the delinquents are dead, and no one knows where the nerds have gone. As for who killed the bullies, it was an unknown individual who was simply unstoppable, and who also stole all the weapons they brought into this world. According to Kazakazi, that swordsman must be a genius, for he surely planned this entire scheme in advance. Moreover, the leader claims this stranger must be after the class representative because she possesses the abduction skill, which allows the user to steal an enemy's abilities upon killing them. In other words, it's the most overpowered and sought-after skill imaginable. Aside from that, Haruka is worried because in his mind only he and the nerds knew that girl had this ability. In reality, the athletes just assumed she had this power because the swordsman kept asking about the representative. Ultimately, he let the group live because he figured at some point the athletes would go after the representative, which would give him a chance to follow them to his target. However, the athletes decided to wander through the forest to avoid doing what the enemy wanted and ended up nearly dead there. Anyway, the mysterious foe will surely follow the blood trail to this location. But with Haruka's help, the team leader thinks they can win this fight by joining forces. Hearing this, Haruka reflects that he would hate to get involved in this dispute because his only desire is to live alone and in peace in this forest, but duty calls and he can't just ignore what's happening. With that in mind, he announces that he will help, but not with the athletes and instead alone. Thus, they should head to the city and join the girls. Soon after the men leave, Haruka knows it would be easier to have them at the rear, but if everyone dies to this mysterious swordsman, no one will be left to protect the women. Meanwhile, the girls look for the lone wanderer around Omiyu. But even though Haruka left a letter, the class representative can't help but worry. Back to the protagonist, he heard from the athletes about the swordsman's weapon skill. Although such a skill is powerful, once you initiate it, you cannot cancel it, and it leaves the user vulnerable. Haruka needs to find a way to exploit this weakness, but for that, he needs to level up to match his opponent. Thus, he defeats some goblins along the way, but it's not enough because he needs stronger opponents. Then he's lucky to encounter the Goblin King, which might be his chance to gain enough experience. However, he must first defeat this monster, which is definitely not weak. Being careful not to be crushed by that huge club, Haruka finds an opening to cast the magic envelope, which gathers several spells into one. With it, he strikes a mortal blow on the enemy and resolves the dispute. Next, to his surprise, the Goblin Emperor appears, a level 50 creature well above the level 9 of the Lone Wanderer. Haruka figures he cannot face such a monster head-on, but since he's not confident he can escape, he only has the option to use the same tactic as before, mixing all the terrible skills he has to form a single magic. Done this, he charges at the goblin and applies this technique, which seemed to have caused some damage, even though the monster gets up again and does not seem so affected. Soon, it retaliates from the suffered attack and slashes the face of the Lone Wanderer, who has to dodge to avoid the potentially fatal blow. Finding a minimal opening, Haruka takes advantage and counterattacks with his staff, and finally, the Goblin Emperor's HP is reduced to almost half. But the creature starts to heal immediately and launches a powerful skill that throws the boy back with force. After colliding with some trees and feeling that he is hanging by a thread, Haruka remembers that he cannot falter at this moment because his friends depend on the success of his mission. Keeping this in mind, he attacks the Goblin Emperor with the remaining strength he has. Hours later, when the sun rises again in the forest, Haruka is exhausted after taking down his enemy. Suddenly, he lets out a shout of relief to celebrate his ascent to level 11. Then he goes to his home in the cave to discover the skills he gained. The skill he invented, where various magics are mixed into one, now resolves the opening left by the use of a weapon skill, allowing him to attack without preparation as soon as he selects the skill. Later, a man approaches Haruka's dwelling, and as he gets closer to the Lone Wanderer, he lowers his hood and reveals himself to be Tanaka, the boy who supposedly suffered bullying from the bullies but actually had much more sophisticated plans than just suffering at the hands of those boys. Meanwhile, the girls return to Omiyu after another day of hunting, only to find the athletes at the city wall. In the meantime, Kakizaki explains that Haruka stayed behind to face an enemy personally. In the forest, the Lone Wanderer sarcastically welcomes Tanaka into his residence, while the opponent laments not yet having reached the class representative through those nearly dead athletes, especially after all the effort he made to infiltrate the group of bullies and control them all. With that said, Haruka realizes that Tanaka was behind all this the whole time, and he confesses that he used the delinquents to separate the entire class. Furious, Haruka asks about the other men of the group besides the athletes and bullies, then the boy responds remorselessly that they are all dead, but soon decides to stop the small talk because his priority is to reach the abduction skill as soon as possible and not waste time with a loser who ended up with all the worst skills like Haruka. Hearing these words, Haruka points his weapon at the opponent and prevents his departure. Then Tanaka decides to kill the Lone Wanderer right there. With impressive skill, he lifts rocks from the ground, causing a cloud of dust with his power just to show off what he's capable of. Having done that, he comments that he remembers the dreadful skills left over in the White Room, so he knows well that Haruka won't be able to defeat him with the worst skills. Unlike the Lone Wolf, his rival has a varied array of techniques and isn't afraid to use them. As he conjures rocks and hurls them at his target, Tanaka also uses his interference ability, a vocal command that causes a strange reaction in Haruka's body. Meanwhile, upon discovering that the protagonist is fighting alone in the forest, the class representative rushes to help, but Kazakazi stops her, claiming that Haruka can handle it alone. Back to the Lone Wolf, he struggles to dodge the stones thrown by Tanaka, especially since the opponent's interference ability seems to limit his movements. On the other hand, Tanaka acknowledges that the opponent dodged his projectiles well, but as he summons new magic, he doubts the boy will have the same luck. Nevertheless, Haruka manages to keep up and escape defeat, but it seems increasingly difficult to stay in the contest. Arrogantly, Tanaka points out that he already knew the Lone Wolf was weak, but he didn't expect him to have the slightest ability to survive these attacks. Haruka thanks him ironically, while Tanaka, before killing his rival, would like to know when the lone wolf began to suspect him. Haruka says he felt something strange from the start because a math genius hanging out with bullies was not something common. Tanaka responds that the boy has good eyes, then acknowledges that he isn't as stupid as he thought. After answering the question, Haruka also has a doubt how long Tanaka has been planning all this. Soon the villain reveals that from the beginning, as soon as he noticed the lack of the kidnapping skill. When he acquired his interference technique, he felt he could control the bullies, use them at his whim, and get what he wants. After revealing his plan, Tanaka binds the enemy's foot with roots from the ground and declares that this fight ends now. Then, with an intense blaze, he sets fire to Haruka and regrets that this duel has been so disappointing. However, from the heavy layer of fire that formed in the environment, Haruka managed to absorb the power of the adversary in such a way that he came out unscathed from the attack. Honestly, the lone wolf wasn't sure if it would work, but he had no other option but to try, and all this is due to the mistletoe vine he accidentally combined in that magic item shop, because its effect is absorption. Thus, the protagonist understands that it's his time to strike back while Tanaka isn't using his weapon skill and is off guard. However, as he strikes with his cane, Haruka sees the enemy quickly conjuring a sword to block the attack. Tanaka mocks the fact that his opponent thought this would be his moment of victory and assures that he doesn't need his magic to win this fight. In other words, the villain was just bluffing while he decided which weapon he would use to destroy his target. The choice between the sword and the spear seems difficult for Tanaka, so he leaves it to chance to decide. But in the end, he decides to use all of his weapons at the same time. Alternating between equipment with different characteristics, the math genius manages to confuse his adversary with various attack patterns. Given the intensity of that conflict, Haruka can't avoid all the blows, so he ends up suffering a powerful shock that throws him far away. Whole before his target, who is now decisively weakened, Tanaka would love to know if he already feels defeated. As he struggles to stand, Haruka analyzes that the enemy has a huge variation of attacks, which makes it complicated to find an opening in his defense. Thinking about it, he asks if Tanaka used the mimic skill to copy the skills of others. Then the opponent needs to admit once more that the guy is smart with these deductions. Haruka accuses the enemy of being after the class representative's kidnapping skill, but Tanaka confesses that he doesn't just want that skill. Any that are overpowered, he will copy until he becomes unbeatable. Then he attacks with a new ability from a scythe. Haruka knows that the longer this fight lasts, the more insane skills that guy is capable of showing. Moreover, even if Haruka goes on the offensive, Tanaka easily escapes the blows with his illusion technique. This perception makes the lone wolf lower his cane along with his head and think that there's no way to hit this opponent. Taking advantage of the target's lowered guard, Tanaka charges at him, but Haruka anticipates with the psych ability, which allows the lone wolf to dodge the attack. At the same time he comments to Tanaka they can only use the same power 3 times. Unmasked, Tanaka loses much of his arrogance at the same time as he seems surprised not to be able to use the techniques that were part of his repertoire in this fight. That's when Haruka reveals that he discovered the weakness of the mimic skill after provoking a sequence of attacks from his opponent. In fact, Tanaka only used each ability twice. After saying this, Haruka reflects alone that he can win the fight if he continues to escape from the attacks suffered. With this discovery, Tanaka is no longer the same, especially since his adversary had already become accustomed to the speed imposed by him, which made the dodges easier. From there, Haruka begins to control the duel and counterattack mercilessly until he knocks the rival down a tree. Thinking that this is his chance to end it, the lone wolf rushes towards Tanaka after he had used his illusion twice. However, the math genius proves that he's not defeated by conjuring a fast and powerful fireball. Even missing his target, Tanaka manages to make Haruka retreat by presenting another great demonstration of power. Despite this, the boy shows a strong emotional discontrol as he revolts for losing to a failure like Haruka, and this attitude may show a weakness to be exploited. One way or another, the user of 1,000 skills still has one more card up his sleeve, a stolen ability more powerful than any seen in this world. With that, Tanaka zigzagged toward Haruka, his form engulfed in a ghostly purple aura. He was soon attacking from all sides, his rival hardly knowing where he was striking from. Suddenly, Tanaka appeared overhead, convinced he could end it all, but the solitary one narrowly escaped, although troubled by the sheer power of the ability, which had devastated the ground with just the impact of Tanaka's strike. Next, Tanaka subdued his opponent with a death skill, enveloping him with powerful spirits that seemed to drain his life force. Without delay, the protagonist weakened and collapsed to the ground. Seeing his strategy succeed, Tanaka let out a loud laugh and stepped on his foe's head, thinking Haruka was dead. He regretted wasting so many skills in a single fight, but once he obtained the seizure skill, he could steal as many spells as he wanted. In the end, the genius kicked the solitary's head and said his forever goodbye, then turned and walked away. However, defying expectations, Haruka stood up and asked if this guy really thought he could just kick someone's head and walk away. Incredulous, Tanaka stressed that the death skill should work on anyone at level 11, and according to him, this power was 100% effective. Haruka explained he was a user of the well-being skill, so such tricks didn't work on him as this skill grants resistance to negative statuses. Moreover, the solitary reminded that his luck attribute had been extraordinary ever since he decided to pour all his points into it, and with such a high status, Haruka could make any magic cast on him likely to fail. Given his absurd luck, this probability significantly increased. Tanaka argued that the enemy fell precisely because the skill had worked, but Haruka blatantly revealed he was just playing dead, though that kick to the head was a huge blunder by Tanaka. Confused, the rival wondered how Haruka could move, given that he had imposed the interference skill on him at the start. Haruka disclosed that one of his lesser abilities, called mannequin, had allowed him to dodge the incoming attacks with imaginary ropes binding his body. At this point, Tanaka completely lost control and attacked in desperation, while Haruka easily countered every skill without breaking a sweat. Mentally devastated, Tanaka couldn't understand how his calculations had gone wrong in this fight. According to him, 1 + 1 always equals 2. That's how things work. Haruka agreed that the math was correct, but only in their original world. In this world, things were entirely different. Hearing these harsh words, Tanaka remembered his boring days as a student. The classes were too easy for someone of his genius, and the intellectual gap between him and his classmates fostered some disdain. Day after day, all he wanted was for the unbearable routine of school to end once and for all. That was when it happened. Faced with that unimaginable sight, Tanaka finally found motivation in life. In front of the skills board, he felt empowered, able to end his days of endless boredom, so he used every trick possible to craft his journey in this world as thrilling as possible, even if it meant discarding the lives of his classmates. If he killed everyone and stole all the overpowered skills, Tanaka would finally be powerful, invincible, perfect. Despite these expectations, the prodigy student found himself lost against a solitary excluded who ended up with the worst abilities anyone could have, but by no means did this mean he would give in. Driven by rage, Tanaka insisted on attacking with his sword, but soon the enemy disarmed him. Thinking Tanaka had no skills left, Haruka advanced to end the fight, but the genius's sword had returned on its own and pierced the attacker's shoulder. Taking advantage of Haruka's weakness, the foe struck several times with his sword, continuously repeating that 1 + 1 will always be 2. At that moment, Haruka retaliated with his cane to the face of the enemy and noted that he had become too sure of himself and lazy with all those overpowered skills he had easily acquired. As he spoke, a solitary displayed a golden aura around his body. As a last attempt, Tanaka charged again, but Haruka used his invented ability to finish the duel. Finally, in front of his kneeling and defeated rival, Haruka noted that even the worst abilities have their use, then walked away. Amid this, the prodigy boy collapsed on the ground. Far away, Haruka felt the pain of exhaustion and his severe injuries, then thought of his friends. He apologized to all of them, knelt, and imagined this was his end, but the nerds arrived just in time and prevented him from hitting the ground. They explained they had been searching for the solitary and came to help, then carried the injured through the forest. Along the way, Haruka wondered why the nerds had come for him. Then Oda explained that once they returned from a dungeon, the class was in town and worried about the solitary fighting in the forest without help, so they decided to come to his aid. Soon, the group returned to Omui and Haruka received all the attention from the girls. For him, a typical representative of the solitary class, it was understandably uncomfortable. At one point, the girls captured the citizen to give him a proper bath against his will. Meanwhile, the snobs asked forgiveness for having been in favor of expelling the nerds from the camp and thanked them for everything they had done for the group. Hearing this conversation, Haruka realized he had already ensured the safety of the class representative and others, so he tried to slip away and return to his life as a solitary, but the representative caught him once more. Then she hugged the boy and questioned why he wanted to leave so badly. Moreover, she was worried Haruka had died. He asked if he had made the girl cry again, but this time she said no, especially now that her friend was back. Either way, now it was time for Haruka to get an earful from each of the girls in the class for what he had done, and there was no escaping it. In the next scene, the protagonist has a strange dream about a mysterious girl who had waited for a long time in the depths of darkness to finally emerge. Rising from his bed in the inn, the boy feels the fatigue and pain from his intense fight against Tanaka. Outside his room, he runs into the nerds who are after a rare item in the dungeon that can change how people see and think about you. Annoying, Haruka remarks that such a thing is perfect for someone as shady as Oda, prompting the boy to retort that he doesn't need to hear this from someone like the loner. The nerds then set off on another expedition, making the protagonist believe they are seriously undertaking this unexpected journey. By the way, regarding his recent deeds, he reflects on having met the nerds and defeated Tanaka, so there seems no need to stick around. In other words, it's time to return to life in the cave. However, as soon as he finishes his sentence and moves to leave, Haruka senses the inevitable presence of the class representative, whose fury radiates around her body, ready to scold him for his unfounded decision. With anger spreading through her eyes like flames, she calls him aside for a chat. Haruka hopes it won't be another telling off like yesterday's, as he's had more than enough of that from all the girls. On that note, the representative reminds him that he hasn't heard anything from her yet, and seizing what seems like the perfect opportunity, she asks why he did something so dangerous alone. But before he can answer, she pleads with him not to do it again. With that, Haruka kneels and apologizes, and the girl accepts it gracefully. Relieved, Haruka reflects that this is far more traumatic than facing Tanaka. If he wants to dodge the representative's wrath and live a peaceful life, the loner considers going after the item the nerds mentioned, which can change how people think and see you. If he can make everyone like him, Haruka would never again get scolded unjustly, so he decides it's time to head for the dungeon. Meanwhile, in Lord Omi's mansion, Mariel's father works tirelessly in his office until his daughter emerges and emphasizes that he needs a break. The man agrees but remembers that the city under his protection lies on the frontier, and with the rise in monster activity in the area, it will see fewer merchants, which will directly impact the economy. Therefore, it is of utmost importance that this matter receives proper attention. Suddenly, a soldier who had been sent on an expedition in the dungeon returns in a hurry, warning that an endless horde of monsters is approaching. Unlike the terrified warrior, Haruka walks leisurely through the fields in search of the dungeon until his perception indicates the arrival of monsters nearby. Soon, the first horde appears to confront him, but the boy considers these enemies merely a warm-up for what is to come. At the Adventurers Guild of Onmi, the guild master asks the class representative to handle the monsters on the road until Mariel arrives running and alerts that a horde of orcs is coming to attack the city. Moreover, the neighboring villages have been decimated. Without delay, the adventurers present Rise to defend the territory as the representative rushes to inform her friends about the situation. Meanwhile, she wonders where Haruka has gotten to this time. Speaking of the devil, he charges at the enemy horde, even though he's never seen so many orcs gathered at once, especially a so-called orc king among the opposing group. Nevertheless, with just one strike, the loner takes down most of the foes. In a short while, Onmi prepares its defense forces to face the orc invasion. Fighting the level 37 Orc King, Haruka can't bring him down with a single blow, but a flurry changes the situation, and the monster falls. Seeing the pile of orcs scattered on the ground, the human wonders what might have caused such a buildup of monsters in the area, but frankly, he doesn't care enough to worry much. In truth, he just wants to reach the dungeon and find his coveted rare item. Thus, his next step is to use his stealth skill to enter the dungeon unnoticed by the guards. Once inside, Haruka smiles, imagining that this cracked floor must hold many stories of adventurers over the years as well as its vast corridors. Either way, the boy needs to focus on finding the item he came for, so he searches the place until he finds his first treasure chest. Unfortunately, it contains only useless equipment and the like, and his bad luck continues with the next chests he finds, all with ridiculous rewards. Faced with such misfortune, Haruka regrets not having asked someone about the location of the item he wants, but soon he gets the idea to ask the merchant from the dungeon's magic item shop. With that, the boy wastes no time and heads to the exit to return to the city and seek this information. As night falls, Onmi's defenses feel a chill while waiting for the orcs. The guild master wonders if they should have arrived by now, then Mariel responds that she thinks so. When the noble says thinks, the men worry this might be false news, but at that moment, a silhouette appears behind the smoke, keeping all the soldiers alert. However, it turns out to be just young Haruka yawning on the road. The representative approaches in a hurry and alerts that the neighboring village was attacked by monsters, and now Omi is in danger. Along with her, other girls from the class join to scold him again, as he's becoming an expert at disappearing and leaving everyone worried. Regarding the monsters that should have been attacking the city, Haruka comments that perhaps he beat them all up earlier. And although this was a brave act, the girls complain once again that he only gets into trouble. Soon after, in the tavern, as the adventurers glare at the solitary, the lord's daughter thanks him for defending the town from the monsters. The guild master also expresses his gratitude but emphasizes that Haruka should not act so carelessly. Soon, Mariel and the representative join in to scold the citizen further, leaving him even more distraught. The master assures there was a good reason for being hard on the young man, as the monsters had been much more active recently, with some even emerging from the dungeon. This suggested that humans might expect several hordes of creatures any day now. Following this dialogue, Haruka lies on his bed and complains that every day more people join in to nag him, pushing him further away from the solitary life he so desired. More than ever, Haruka longs for the rumored item that could make everyone see him differently. At dawn on the 27th, the protagonist arrives at the magic item shop and panics the owner. For the last and only time this fellow had shown up, it was to cause a huge problem. To calm the man down, he informed him that he wasn't there to buy anything, but to inquire about an item that makes people like you more. Not knowing exactly what it was about, the shop owner assumed the young man was referring to the pheromone ring and mentioned that this item should be below the 50th floor of the dungeon. Excited, Haruka asked how many floors the dungeon had, and he was told that there are about 100, but you cannot simply go down one by one without first defeating the floor master, a boss that exists on each level. According to an old legend, that place is home to the Dungeon Emperor, although this is a story shrouded in mysteries. If you wanted to explore the place, Haruka would need recovery items. Hearing this, Haruka rushed to the general item shop, leaving the magic shop owner empty-handed because he meant that he had useful items for the adventure. In the midst of all this, two people from the class were eavesdropping on the conversation. Without delay, the representative learned that the solitary was after the pheromone ring in the dungeon. So the girls decided, once and for all, to do their utmost to prevent the guy from getting into another mess. By the way, we again see Haruka walking calmly toward his mission. However, his perception skill identified more elements approaching the area, but instead of terrible orcs, they were terrible class representatives and their colleagues, walking toward the boy with fury on their faces. Outraged, Haruka questioned what they were doing there, but the representative was undaunted and accused him of looking for the pheromone ring. Haruka lied and claimed he was after Solomon's ring, a rare item that allows you to talk to animals. However, as no one believed that lie, the boy took a more extreme action and simply ran toward the dungeon. Upon arriving there, the guard tried to warn that the dungeon was closed off due to imminent danger, but since no one obeyed, he wasn't going to force those dozens of people out by himself. Inside, Haruka reflected that things would get ugly if the representative found the pheromone ring before him, so he sped out to get ahead. The woman complained that the guy might fall into a trap if he ran so carelessly, but he assured her that his luck status would keep him alive just fine. Having said that, he stumbled on a false wall and fell into an extremely deep hole. A friend tried to save him but couldn't reach him in time to prevent his fall. Given the height, Haruka used earth magic to soften the ground and bounce on it as if it were a cushion. Apparently, he had fallen all the floors of the dungeon in that fall, which meant that from that corridor he could encounter the final boss at any moment. To get back from where he came, he used air walk, but he couldn't climb the endless floors. Therefore, his only chance was to find another way out. Surprised to know what the layout of this place was like, he realized he had developed the spatial awareness and trap detection skills, both at level 1. Without wasting time, the adventurer cast both abilities and noted that there were no traps down the corridor. Besides, he discovered he was on floor 101 below what would be the last floor, which means there probably was a secret boss around. Meanwhile, the class group set out in search of Haruka. With his lungs burning, the solitary advanced through the corridor, crossing a dense and extremely powerful magical smoke. As he walked, torches with blue flames lit up and illuminated the path until he reached a door that left no doubt about what was on the other side. Upon opening it, he was met with an intense magical layer that pushed him back, but he struggled to stay on his feet, and in front of him he glimpsed the Dungeon Emperor level 100. Meanwhile, on floor 47, the group lit some bonfires and discussed Haruka's whereabouts. With each floor's boss defeated, a teleport was activated to return to the start of the dungeon, making Shimazaki think that the solitary had simply gone back to the top. On the other hand, Ona believed that Haruka was at the bottom of the dungeon. Either way, Kakizaki was sure that the boy would find a way out, but Oda remembered that at the bottom, there was the Dungeon Emperor, whose presence made the other monsters stronger. Shimazaki thought that was just a legend, but if it was true, advancing would be difficult due to the increased difficulty of the enemies on the deeper floors. Still, everyone decided it was worth the risk to save their friend and planned to continue the journey as far as they could. At the same time, Haruka used his ability to try to identify the opponent's stats, but that creature remained a great mystery as to its capabilities. The racial classes of the Dungeon Emperor are Dullahan, Lich, and Undead King, 3 of the most powerful. Undoubtedly, Tanaka would not be able to touch a finger on an enemy of this level. Liches are specialists in magic, so Haruka knew he would be defeated if he kept his distance, which is why he needed to get close for hand-to-hand combat. In an initial attempt to attack, the human struck the adversary with his staff, but with unbelievable speed, the skeleton blocked the assault. Undeterred, Haruka used his invented ability and repeated the move. Once again, it was blocked without difficulty. Nevertheless, he had no choice but to defeat the Dungeon Emperor. Later, on a night filled with thunder, Marielle serves tea to her father and comments that the dark clouds are swirling around the extreme dungeon. Reflecting on this, the noblewoman can't help but imagine that they are about to face something far worse than the horde of orcs that just appeared. In response to her observation, the Lord of Omi asks his daughter to send a message to the Adventurers Guild, instructing them to be ready for an emergency. Meanwhile, facing the Dungeon Emperor, Haruka assesses that to defeat a creature of this level, he must blend all his skills at record speed. After circling the monster using his swiftness, he finds a moment to strike, but the Emperor blocks it. Since that speed wasn't enough, the adventurer decides to increase it further, yet he is blocked again. Without giving up, Haruka strives to boost his speed to a level where he can hit the opponent, but all his efforts seem in vain against the incalculable reflexes of the skeleton. To make matters worse, the monster nearly pierces Haruka's torso with its sword, tearing his tunic with a grazing blow that nearly cost him his life. Faced with such an intense challenge and encountering speed almost invisible to the naked eye, Haruka's contact lenses develop a new ability. Although it was just a kind of flash, the boy feels he can see the future. However, the rule is clear: any mistake he makes means certain death. Therefore, it is crucial to keep his eyes wide open at all times. Returning to the attack with heightened attention after a quick exchange of blows, Haruka ironically finds humor in his near-death condition. This feeling confuses him, as clearly he should be feeling this way at the moment. Funny or not, the truth is that he has almost no magic or energy left, which could determine his end soon. On the other side, the Dungeon Emperor seems unscathed in combat, and Haruka is well aware of this. Surely, if he is attacked now, it will be the end for the adventurer. However, for some reason, the skeleton takes a few steps toward the human, but contrary to expectations, it just stands there. Not understanding the reason for this passivity, Haruka takes the opportunity to analyze that this enemy does not compare to the others he has faced. Therefore, he concludes that the Dungeon Emperor does not want to kill him because if it wanted to, it would have done so already. Not admitting defeat, the boy decides to resume the attack as a form of revolt against the opponent's passivity. Suddenly, when the creature points its sword at the human's neck, Haruka immediately stops his attempt to fight while doubts only increase in his mind. After all, this skeleton must have some reason for sparing the adventurer like this. As the skeleton raises its sword, Haruka sees all the miasma swirling around the monster's body and notices that this substance seems to control the body like a malevolent entity, forcing the skeleton to act in this manner. Suddenly, Haruka's staff begins to glow and absorb the miasma as if it had awakened some sacred ability unknown even to its owner. Be that as it may, it seems to be his best bet at the moment. Thus, he simply lets that energy flow naturally and sees what happens. Confident with the transformation in his weapon, the boy attacks again, keeping his staff close to that dark and grotesque substance in a way that he can suck every piece of it and end the force control it exercised over the monster's body. With some persistence, Haruka manages to execute his plan and end the miasma. As he thought, indeed, it was manipulating the dungeon boss. After the nightmare ends, the boy supposes the skeleton was trying to die to rid itself of servitude, which is why it was not attacking to kill, attempting to take the fatal blow that would end its life. To be sure of his theory, the human lays his sword on the ground as a way to raise the white flag, a sign of a ceasefire. However, the black miasma he absorbed begins to be expelled back around the monster's body, making Haruka think that only death will free this creature from suffering. With this in mind, he raises his staff to deliver the final blow, but something inside him says that it's not the right thing to do. Instead of acting with violence, he releases his weapon and embraces the enemy. After all, the Dungeon Emperor has been all this time alone, fighting against this bad influence in its body. Suddenly, he realizes he has activated the subdue ability on the skeleton, so he apologizes as he doesn't even know how to control this technique or cancel it. At least the boy imagines this must have freed the monster from the miasma. As a sign of friendship, Haruka takes courage and extends his hand to greet the skeleton, but it does not respond. This leaves the poor fellow desperate, thinking the monster is angry for having been subdued. However, the former enemy shakes its head negatively, stating it's not a problem. In the end, the skeleton finally shakes the boy's hand, who uses his evaluation skill just for peace of mind. He notices that the monster's level has been reset, perhaps because of the subdue ability. Additionally, its name changed to Angelica, and the fact that it has been a girl all this time drives the protagonist crazy, as this is yet another case where he subdued a girl in this nonsensical isekai. Putting that small detail aside, the citizen advises both to get out of there as soon as possible, With Angelica's approval, Haruka activates his spatial awareness skill as they leave the boss's room and realizes that a staircase might be the way for them to return to the surface. But instead of following the path in peace, something unexpected happens. Against all odds, the boss of this floor emerges, an enemy called Living Armor, also level 100. Immediately, Haruka puts his hands on his head because he really doesn't have what it takes to fight these absurdly high-level monsters. Looking around for an escape, the guy would give anything to flee this battle and climb the stairs peacefully. But since it's difficult to leave in this manner, he uses his head to think of a creative solution. Raising his staff, the adventurer activates his earth ability to collapse part of the ceiling and plans to ascend using air walk. However, in the gap left by the boy, it's possible to see two minotaurs approaching around the hole, all level 99. As if humanoid bulls joining the boss wasn't enough, they leap into the fray in the most ludicrous way possible. They land right on top of the living armor, and let's just say, they turn the poor thing into dead armor. As for the minotaurs, they themselves end up as slaughtered cattle from the fall damage. No doubt, putting all of his points into luck has made Haruka a peculiar opponent in this isekai. The real surprise comes when Angelica shows interest in the armor lying on the ground. She quickly dons it but struggles with its weight. Instead of removing it, she casts a spell to adjust the armor to fit her true female form. Puzzled, Haruka assesses the armor with his skill and remarks that it's a cursed silver armor that fuses with the user's flesh and bone. Thinking the boy is mocking her new outfit, the girl displays her outrage and storms off ahead pouting. Watching her act like a class representative, Haruka thinks of calling her the armor representative. Speaking of the girl, along with the rest of the group, they continue their search for the lost member. As they debate whether the guy has already ascended and they are wasting their time, they make their way down to the 50th floor. There, they encounter a gigantic four-armed cyclops. Meanwhile, Marielle reaches the Omu Guild and informs the local master about her bad feeling. The master argues that the guards haven't reported any unusual activity, although Ofter and Gedtek think the patrol can't be fully trusted. Therefore, they decide to warn everyone to be on alert. On this note, the chief wonders about the whereabouts of the new adventurers group, but the two men can't provide any information since they haven't seen any of them today. Worried, Marielle hopes her premonition is wrong. In the meantime, Haruka finds that giving Angelica a storage lid slightly improves her mood. But this relief is short-lived as he detects the presence of a monster. Using his appraisal, he spots a level 98 Lich approaching, immune to physical attacks and only vulnerable to holy magic. Immediately, the adventurer thinks about making another escape through a hole in the floor above, but fears what might come through this time. Without a break, the Lich launches an attack at Haruka, who narrowly dodges a deadly spell with a shake of his head. This motion is the reminder he needs that he holds the perfect weapon to counter a dark magic monster in his hands. He points his cane at the creature and lets the holy magic flow. Proud of his cane, he reflects that he thought this stick was useless, but in the end, it's been what's saving him from these troubles. Next, he encounters a group of giant moths at level 97. Knowing their dust is poisonous, Haruka keeps his distance and conjures fire to deal with the insects. Instead of throwing it directly at the enemies, he deliberately misses, letting the flame hover among the insects. Drawn to the light, the moths fly towards the fire and Haruka increases the intensity of the magic to burn them all at once. On the next floor, Haruka and Angelica come across venom crawlers, giant caterpillars at level 96, which will one day become the moths of the next floor. These caterpillars emit a magical fabric that can cause issues, so the boy decides he needs to deal with this first. He creates a thin floor beneath the insects, and then rolls it up over them like a steamroller. On the 95th floor, Haruka feels something different from the previous levels, something much more powerful. Further ahead, behind a strange purple smoke swirling through the air, there are swords lined up. With great cunning, he and Angelica dodge a surprise attack just in time. There's no doubt it's a new boss, a creature called the Living Sword, another level 100, to Haruka's delight at being on the 95th floor, thinking the damn thing would also be at this level. One way or another, there's no escaping the conflict, especially since this enemy is quite cunning. Besides being fast and skilled, the monster has tricks up its sleeve that give it an advantage in battle, like controlling swords around the environment to hurl at targets. Annoyed by the boss's cheap tactics, Haruka wonders who could save the day. Then he looks beside him and realizes the answer has always been right under his nose. Angelica, of course. Without hesitation, Haruka asks his new comrade for help. With just one strike, she ends it all, leaving the guy amazed at the new ally he gained for nothing. Back on the 50th floor, the other class members do what they can against the Cyclops, but the adventurers' exhaustion suggests this is the end of their journey. Almost out of hope, Kazakazi digs deep within himself for motivation to keep fighting, and the image of Haruka saying they are the best athletes there could be comes to his mind. Oda knows if the Lone One were there, he'd still be standing tall. Convinced they can still fight, they regroup to try a new strategy. Using a group of students to withstand the Cyclops' attacks, Kazakazi seizes an opening to leap onto the monster and activates his explosion acceleration to sprint at high speed toward the target's head. But before he can reach it, he's violently hit and knocked down. However, this was part of the plan, as Kazakazi was just the decoy for Oda to cast his spell, which pierces the Cyclops' face, ending the fight. Meanwhile, Haruka reaches the 85th floor and senses the presence of a huge horde of monsters.
Outside the dungeon, the guard in charge of the entrance grumbles that the kids have decided to rush in like madmen, despite the authorities' warnings of danger. Suddenly, several rats scurry under his feet. With this, the man turns his gaze toward the interior of the dungeon and notices the approach of monsters. In haste, the knight goes to the guild and informs the master of the situation. The leader concludes that the day has finally come. From the deepest dungeon, a stampede of creatures roams the land of men. Upon hearing this, Muriel discovers that her worst fears have come true, while Godek worries that the dungeon folk might not be okay. Pensive, the master stands up to find an old document about the dungeon in his office. Upon finding the document, he shows it to the other meeting members and explains that dungeons are like living beings, spreading downward floor by floor. And when they grow to the limit, on the deepest floor of all the monsters that can no longer inhabit that space end up coming out like water overflowing from a full glass. After questions what can be done about this, the boss explains that, according to this text, when the boss of the lowest floor is defeated, the dungeon dies along with him, as do all the monsters created by that place. Therefore, the only way to defeat the stampede is by facing the final boss. Godek wants to know who could possibly do such a thing, while the image of Haruka comes to Muriel's mind, but she shakes her head to dismiss the thought. At that moment, the entire structure trembles and threatens to collapse, so the guild master orders Ofter to guide the people to the shelters, while Godek must send to the front gate all those capable of fighting. They must protect the territory with their lives, if necessary. Lastly, the master conjures a fire spell that spreads around his body, barely able to wait to teach the invaders a lesson. Back inside the dungeon, Haruka notices the presence of griffins flying over the floor where he stands alongside Angelica. As he wonders whether these creatures are birds or lions, he decides to sprinkle salt on a paralyzing fish and throw it at the winged monsters, which scramble over a small piece of the food. Once he succeeds, they all fall to the ground, making room for the lone wanderer to descend another floor. Meanwhile, on the 54th floor, the class representative asks her companions to keep pace, even though it's tough. Despite the great effort, all are committed to finding Haruka. However, just ahead, the group encounters dozens of werewolves. In the city of Amui, the adventurers have just resisted the first wave of enemies, and several warriors are injured right from the start. Mourning the facts laid out before them, Muriel discovers in the worst way what a stampede is. Given the critical situation, Ofter asserts that the path is to ask the dungeon outsiders to face the final boss, and the guild leader believes Haruka can handle the job. The problem is that they have no way to contact the young lone wanderer. Godek wonders who would be crazy enough to send a message to him amid this chaos. Then, all three men look straight at Muriel, who realizes she is being pushed into this distasteful job and refuses in every way, out of desperation, because she doesn't want to go to the dungeon alone. The master acknowledges that this mission is too crucial to be put on the shoulders of a young girl, so he sends Ofter to accompany her, especially since he knows the dungeon well. Ofter complies with the order, but remembers that other attacks will occur against the city. Nevertheless, the leader ensures that Amui will be safe because those who remain will be enough. Thus, the subordinate calls Muriel to set off. The girl looks around at all the wounded and trembles, but still, she gathers the courage to do what must be done. On the 81st floor, Haruka and Angelica encounter a floor filled with water, and the boy notes that the lower floors are the worst. But that doesn't mean the upper ones don't have their challenges. Then, fish attack the lone wanderer. However, Angelica steps in front and takes them all out with a slash of her sword. Assessing the creatures, Haruka realizes they are level 81 swordfish, and this makes him understand that it won't be very positive if these creatures jump on him all at once. Thinking of what to do to slow down the enemies, he remembers that fishmongers usually freeze their supplies, so he uses his ice magic to immobilize the fish. After that, Haruka and Angelica leap across the rocks that made way to the other side of the river, while a huge shadow continues swimming underwater toward the humans. Soon after, the shadow reveals itself on the surface as the boss of that floor, a huge fish that summons a wave against its opponents. Swiftly, Angelica gets out of there before she gets hurt, but Haruka is left behind and is hit. While the lone wanderer sinks, the Dullahan holds her sword, unsure how to reach this aquatic adversary. However, Haruka emerges with a board he created himself through his earth magic. With it, the boy rides the fish's wave in style and hits the creature's head squarely with his cane. After defeating the boss, the pair proceed on their way. Excited about his feats in this dungeon, Haruka admits he's starting to like this place, especially when, on the 79th floor, he finds the Ring of Limitless Fortune, an accessory that increases luck. On the 77th floor, he finds the Blessed Bracelet with a strange advantage of exalting disaster. On the 75th floor, the boss dropped the Necromancer's Jewel, which grants control over the dead. Full of relics, the adventurer realizes he's hit the jackpot, especially when selling all these trinkets and earning good money, or perhaps using them himself to become more powerful. The only but is that, as his luck is at its maximum, he is practically immune to diseases and curses, so these items might not be as useful to him as they should be. Therefore, he hands the gear to the armor representative because, according to the boy, she will be thankful for not being cursed as happened on the last floor of this dungeon. Initially, the girl refuses the gift and doesn't want to accept it at all, but given her teammates' strong insistence, she finally relents and is moved by the items she received. Honestly, Haruka finds this behavior almost human, considering that Angelica is a skeleton, but he lets it go and continues on his way. In the meantime, the Dungeon Emperor removed her helmet, revealing her human form a young and beautiful girl. Yet, concealing her true identity, she quickly put the helm back on and followed her group mate. Back on the 54th floor, Haruka's group managed to defeat the werewolves after a lengthy and fierce battle. Though exhausted, the girls heard another suspicious noise nearby and stood up, ready for more enemies. But it was Muriel and after approaching. Amid this, Haruka and Angelica reached the 74th floor, a place filled with lava. Muriel informed the group that she was sent to find Haruka and ask him to face the final boss, but she broke down crying upon learning the boy was missing. The class representative comforted her, asserting that the lone fighter would surely resolve this issue, while the others began to intensely ponder if there was a quicker way to reach him. Crossing the fiery path, Haruka felt the heat enveloping his body. Using spatial awareness and trap detection, he stayed alert for anything unusual on the ground, but he began to feel he might melt before accomplishing anything in this place. In a moment of distraction, he stumbled on a stone and nearly fell, but Angelica caught him just in time. Then, she pointed to a corner, suggesting Haruka should rest a bit before they continued their journey. As he sat down and took a deep breath, the heat made it hard for the adventurer to fully relax. Frankly, he hadn't expected this floor to be as troublesome as it was turning out to be. Either way, he needed something to boost his energy. But before he could think further, he felt a breeze pass through him. At the same time, the class representative felt the same breeze and heard a voice resembling Haruka's in the distance. It turned out he was shouting with joy after sticking his head into a crevice and using his wind magic as a sort of fan. Through a hole on her floor, she could hear him talking, so she approached the hole and made contact. At first, she asked if he could climb through the hole, but he explained that he hadn't had much luck with that initially, unless there was a rope to pull him up or something similar. Then, the representative asked if anyone had a rope, but no one could assist with that. Thus, he found out that the girl was on the 54th floor and thought the best idea was to run there, as he was already doing. But before that, Muriel reported that the city of Amui was in trouble and that the guild was facing a horde of monsters, but their resistance might not last long. After emphasized that on his way there, he saw a second wave of creatures approaching the city, and even if the adventurers defeated this batch, a third would surely bring Amui to ruin. Finally, Muriel explained that to end the stampede, it was necessary to defeat the dungeon's final boss. Upon hearing this, Haruka glanced sideways at his new companion and told his friends that he had already defeated the boss. However, Oda questioned why another wave of monsters was emerging if that was truly the case. With this in mind, After asked Haruka if he was sure he had finished the job, because if the last floor's boss wasn't dead, the stampede would never end. Facing a difficult situation, Haruka realized he needed to deal with the armored representative, but felt unable to do so. She had been imprisoned and cursed by the shadows for so long in the depths of this dungeon, enduring unimaginable suffering, and it wouldn't be fair to simply take her life after she had tasted freedom again in her soul. Thus, the lone fighter confessed he hadn't killed the final boss, leaving all his teammates shocked at the highest floor. With that, he thought of a way to save Angelica and the city at the same time. Coming up with a plan, he asked the girl not to worry, though he would need her help with what he was about to do. He declared to his companions that he would end this stampede. Outraged, After insisted it wasn't possible without defeating the boss of the last floor. However, the class representative chose to believe in her friend's capability and tried to convince the others that Haruka would put an end to this chaos. After all, everyone knew this boy worried everyone now and then, but despite everything, he always found a way to save the day. For that reason, she was certain Haruka would never betray his group, because that's just who he is. Listening to each word from his comrade, Haruka thanked the class representative for her support, though in a volume only he could hear. Then, he clenched his fist tightly and promised to save every inhabitant of the city of Amui, as well as to finally free Angelica from the prison where she had been held for so long.
In the meantime, hordes continue to surge overwhelmingly toward the wall of Omu. Destroying the monsters left from the last wave, Geitek feels exhausted and begins to doubt that the adventurers will be able to handle such a gigantic threat. Yet, standing firm, the guildmaster orders all combatants to hold their ground and protect the city at all costs. The adventurers' morale is low due to the overwhelming numerical disadvantage, but as the master emphasizes, the Lord's daughter has embarked on a brave mission to the dungeon and needs everyone to hold the defenses until the problem is resolved. With these words, Geitek regains his confidence and decides once and for all that the combatants have no right to falter at this crucial moment. Finally, as the next horde approaches, the master commands his allies to let no enemy pass. Back in the dungeon upon hearing everything that is happening, Haruka promises to ascend as quickly as possible and destroy the onslaught of monsters. Thus, he sets out with Angelica on this spontaneous speedrun. On the 73rd floor, Haruka uses ice to counterattack the lizards and quickly resolve the situation. On the floor above, he uses fire to, once and for all, finish off the scorpions. On the 70th floor, he uses a strange vinegar he bought at the market to impair the two-headed dog's sense of smell, leaving Angelica free to finish the job. As they advance and drop new items, the lone warrior decides to take a break to sift through some interesting equipment and continue towards the goal. Unfortunately, he can't find the pheromone ring he came looking for, but with all these important magical items, perhaps they can level up. Angelica nudges the boy to hint that he needs to rest a bit. However, as much as he knows he is pushing the limits now, Haruka understands that he cannot stop at this moment because it is an urgent matter. On the 69th floor, in an environment resembling a forest, the adventurers encounter a sleep owl, which immediately uses its natural ability to knock out Haruka. The boy believed he would not be affected due to his well-being status, but contrary to his expectations, he stumbles into sleep and can't muster any reaction. Sometime later, when he opens his eyes again, he finds himself being carried by Angelica, who allows him to rest a bit longer until he recovers some of his energy. As for the rest of the group, they are facing the most dangerous monster they have encountered so far, a level 100 creature named Sphinx. With its gigantic paw, the Sphinx attempts to crush the class representative, who narrowly escapes death. The girl laments having to face such a powerful enemy just as they are getting so close to Haruka. Kazakazi tests the opponent's capacity by slashing her several times with his sword, but the beast regenerates quickly and proves that these attacks will have minimal effect. Oda tries a different approach by casting a spell against the Sphinx, but the regeneration process repeats. According to After, even though these attacks worked, they would still be futile. Confused, Shimazaki questions what the man meant by that. Then he explains that sphinxes were created to require the solution to a puzzle and are not beasts that can be defeated with brute force alone. According to rumors, these beasts are immortal. At that moment, the Sphinx unleashes a powerful energy beam at the group, who struggle to avoid their own demise. On the 59th floor, Haruka gets back into action after resting a while, and as they advance a bit, they find part of the floor collapse, making it impossible to pass. Using his perception ability, the protagonist looks up and discovers a supposed alternative passage. In the meantime, the rest of the group is already on the ropes against the powerful Sphinx, which imposes its strength against the humans, who do not even know how to overcome this enigmatic beast. Almost resigned to death, the representative does not see the Sphinx lift its paw towards her head, but before it could crush her, Haruka leaps over the giant creature. Thanks to the combination of the Gauntlet of Contradiction he found in the loot with its runes, he is able to negate the negation of this attack. In other words, he nullifies the Sphinx's invincibility. Confident in his success as he plunges the staff into the back of the monster, the lone warrior lets out a laugh and comments that the Sphinx might be level 100, but it is still just a mini-boss of floor 57. Then Angelica, who is the main boss of the entire dungeon, arrives to give the final blow to the beast. With her sword, the girl slices the Sphinx and resolves the problem once and for all. After the victory, the representative approaches Haruka with joy and welcomes him back. Riding the same wave, the other team members do the same, receiving their friend again in the warmest way possible. By the way, the representative wants to know who the knight beside the lone warrior is, but before he could answer, the floor collapses and drops the boy. However, with his cunning and agility, he climbs the broken debris in the air and manages to return to the floor where he was, impressing everyone. Haruka explains that he has developed several new skills besides already anticipating that this collapse would happen. However, just as he finishes this sentence, he trips over a cracked floor tile and falls into the hole, confessing that he did not expect that. The class representative rushes to grab her friend's hand, even though the memory of the last time she tried to do this, which indeed started this whole situation, reminds her that it all went wrong and Haruka ended up falling. However, this time she manages to arrive in time to grab the boy and prevent his fall. Although it was very difficult, she promises that she would never let go of her friend's hand. Soon, with the help of the others, Haruka is lifted back up and everyone celebrates the survival of their companion. However, Oda points out that it is too early to celebrate because as soon as he points to the hole where Haruka nearly fell, the third horde of monsters passes right below. Without hope, Mariel thinks this will be the end of Onmyu, while everyone present shares this sentiment. Trying to stay calm, the representative reminds Haruka that he had some way to resolve this situation. Then he says that Angelica is the key. The representative asks again who she is, but Mariel interrupts the conversation to hurry back to Onmyu because the city could be destroyed at any moment. At that moment, Ofter commanded everyone to return to the surface via teleport. Haruka was frustrated for not having found any of these during his endless walk, so the warrior explained that he should avoid exploring the dungeon from bottom to top next time. Then, in the middle of the race to the teleport, the representative asked Haruka how he managed to defeat all the powerful monsters that appeared in his path. He explained that under normal conditions, he could never have done it, but even he could thrive in this world with a bit of ingenuity. Later, the group finally reached the entrance of Onmyu. Without wasting any time, Mariel warned that another horde was approaching, this time 10 times larger than the last. As the alert was sounded, scenes of the absurd number of monsters appeared. Then the guild master realized that this indeed was the true stampede, while Gatek commented that this horde made the last one look like child's play. Meanwhile, hidden in the city of Onmyu, the citizens tried to maintain hope as the deafening sound of the monsters' arrival invaded their shelters along with the weight of the horde that shook the entire region. Distraught, Ofter questioned what they could do in the face of this threat as Mariel knelt down and began to pray for her homeland. At that moment, the guild master touched the girl's shoulder as a way to offer comfort. Haruka looked at Angelica, who nodded affirmatively. With that, she stepped forward and plunged her sword into the air, unleashing a devastating power. Watching the scene, Haruka reflected that this girl had defeated countless extremely powerful creatures in the depths of the dungeon, and that the strength of her unshakable reign was enough to keep any enemy at bay, declaring her solitary command over the labyrinth. As Angelica's power spread, the monsters were consumed one by that magic, which shone as brightly as the sun, forcing the fighters of Onmyu to close their eyes to avoid being blinded by such intense and destructive flames. After some time with the disappearance of the brightness, the representative was able to look around and notice that the territory was free from monsters. Likewise, the other warriors were astounded as they contemplated a peaceful late afternoon landscape in Onmyu, completely different from the absolute chaos that had been looming with the horde's approach. Haruka approached Angelica, who was still kneeling with her sword stuck in the ground. When she sheathed her weapon, the solitary greeted her and concluded that somehow the plan had worked. Not understanding anything, the representative inquired how this was possible, while Kazakazi wanted to know if Haruka was responsible for destroying the stampede. But the solitary explained that he had done absolutely nothing. In fact, the savior of the day was Angelica. Oda questioned if she was the dungeon empress, causing a commotion among Onmyu's defensive lines who couldn't believe they were facing such a powerful creature, especially on their side in this war. Keeping calm, Haruka explained that Angelica posed no threat, quite the contrary. Together, the two had traversed the entire dungeon floor by floor, defeating monsters and working as a team, with her even saving the boy several times in the process. Still not fully swallowing the story, Oda recalled that the Emperor of the Dungeon should be the most powerful monster in the hierarchy, even more than the Dungeon King, and that all creatures in the labyrinth should serve this undisputed leader. Haruka joked that Oda was really a nerd to know all that, but this time things were different. In this case, Angelica was indeed the most powerful in the dungeon. Even after a series of circumstances brought her back to level 1, she was capable of subjugating all enemies at any moment. Therefore, Haruka figured that with that power, Angelica could eliminate the entire stampede if she wanted. In the end, he discovered in practice that her power only worked if the monsters were from the same dungeon and were relatively close to her. But the important thing is that it worked out in the end. Shibazaki wanted to know what happened to the monsters that turned to ashes in the process, wondering if they might have been taken somewhere else. However, Haruka guessed that they simply went back home to the dungeon, leaving everyone amazed. That is, Haruka explained that the Dungeon Empress had sent her soldiers back home, nothing more. In other words, Onryu was safe again. With that statement, the people realized the truth and began to celebrate the victory once and for all, while the protagonists celebrated that Angelica had made it out of the dungeon safely. Gradually, the people of Onryu came out of the shelters and were charmed by the peace and security that the late afternoon conveyed around the region. The next day, Haruka decided to check out the items he had collected on the expedition. Hours later, the representative arrived with everyone just as he had asked, and all saw all that rare equipment being displayed in the room as trophies, leaving the companions awestruck. The solitary announced that everything was for sale at the lowest market price and got everyone shopping. Before long, people were fighting to get the best items as if it were a kind of Black Friday. The commotion was such that some group members got injured in the process, but the chance of reversing the situation was zero, so Haruka let the heat rise. From what he could see, the girls in particular awakened their most monstrous side to get what they wanted to take in that sale, leaving the boys scared in a corner of the room. Not wanting to leave the boys empty-handed, the protagonist decided to give away the personal items he had been keeping for himself. When the situation calmed down, he worried about Angelica because even though she was now in the city with the people, she had spent a lot of time alone in that dungeon. Therefore, the question remained whether the girl would be able to socialize with the others and lead a relatively normal life in Onryu. After the negotiations with the rare items Haruka laid on the table, the kid made some serious cash and wasn't afraid to flash a big grin because of it. The class representative approached to thank him and Angelica for everything they'd done. Speaking of whom, she wanted to see the knight introduced to the rest of the group. To skip that part, Haruka did it himself, describing her as a highly reliable skeleton once known as the Dungeon Emperor. The representative was aware of this, but since Angelica had allied with Haruka, her classmate assumed the boy had used a pheromone ring on the skeleton, though the lone wolf hadn't managed to find that item. In reality, he had used his subjugation ability, leaving his friend utterly astonished that he had subdued the strongest creature in the labyrinth. Curious about every detail, she grabbed Angelica by the arm and pulled her aside, leaving Haruka wondering if the noble warrior would be alright. Honestly, he would love for her to mingle with everyone and have a chance at a new life. Soon after, Angelica found herself facing all the girls in the class, ready for a real interrogation. Shibazaki kicked off the questioning by asking if being called Emperor, Angelica was actually a man. Remaining silent as ever, Angelica shook her head no and then confirmed she was a woman. When asked about her age, she indicated 17 with her fingers, the same age as the other girls. The class instantly became excited about this, imagining all they could chat about with this mysterious person. The dungeon woman was a bit tense in this situation, but the representative took her hand and asked if she could talk about herself, even if just a little at a time. The leader had learned that Angelica had been trapped in the darkness of the labyrinth's deepest level until Haruka rescued her. He hadn't let her die and had broken her curse with subjugation, so the representative believed it was time for everyone to embrace this woman and do everything for her. To start off the excellent treatment, the knight was taken for a bath despite her enormous difficulty in removing the heavy armor. The new friend helped peel off the gear, but when she noticed that the girl's leg was normal, not just bones, she and her classmates couldn't hide their shock. The worst in the situation, when she finished removing Angelica's armor, the shock was even greater. Meanwhile, Haruka lay in bed after another hectic day. Despite the satisfaction of getting some rest, a small detail left him thoughtful. After all that trouble, he still ended up without the pheromone ring in the end, remembering he had gone into the labyrinth just to find that item. At least not to say he came away empty-handed. Besides the rare items he found, the lone wolf had leveled up 6 times and increased the power of several skills. Plus, he discovered a teleportation ability that seemed very useful, although he still couldn't use it. And speaking of this whole dungeon saga, the protagonist reflected that he could never have managed the melee without the help of Angelica and his classmates, so he concluded he needed to get stronger if he wanted to fight on his own. With that in mind, the boy planned to return to the forest soon. On day 33 in this world, he stormed the hostel in search of the girl's class leader. The girl early in the morning was still stunned by what she saw yesterday when she took off Angelica's armor. It seems Haruka still doesn't know the truth, and she doesn't know how to tell him. Speaking of the guy, he wanted to know if he could go back to the forest to do his thing. Sheepishly, the girl said yes, as long as he returned, considering there shouldn't be any melee for a good while. After celebrating his freedom, Haruka saw Angelica sitting next to him and imagined she was getting along with the people, but felt it wasn't right just to leave her alone in the city. For that reason, he invited the Dungeon Emperor to come along with him. When Angelica accepted the invitation, the representative's jaw dropped at the thought of the two alone in the woods. Thinking the guy would discover the innocent girl's secret, the leader asked them to stop for a minute but soon questioned why she was making such a drama and pretended it was nothing, letting the duo go for good. With their departure, the girl reflected that this was how things should be. Later, back in his favorite spot, Haruka delighted in the fresh air and already planned to practice his teleportation skill. While he was pleased with how the technique functioned, he still lacked control over it. So the poor guy ended up falling off a cliff, but managed to avoid becoming a meat sandwich with his ability to step on air. However, Angelica, following along, got distracted and slipped on mushrooms on the edge, also falling down. Fortunately for the damsel, the gentleman was there to catch her in his arms, although he thought she was too heavy for a skeleton. At night, when he finally returned to his beloved home, the guy indulged in a solitary bath in the bathtub. Excited, he invited Angelica to join him, but quickly clarified that he was just kidding. Outside the bathroom with a towel in hand, the girl took off her armor, wrapped herself in the towel, and revealed her true identity to the guy. In desperation, Haruka lost his cool and wondered who this person was who had interrupted his bath, but after a few seconds of confusion, he realized it was the very girl he had rescued from the depths of the dungeon. Because of this, after the bath, the lone wolf needed to have a talk with the girl. The problem was, she was so shy that it even made the guy nervous. Since she couldn't say anything, he figured she had been silent for so long that she simply couldn't find her voice. Then, using hand gestures, she explained how she had ended up this way. Formerly, as a spirit, the Dungeon Emperor roamed alone and lifelessly through the labyrinth, but the silver armor restored her flesh and activated her curse. After that, the blessed bracelet negated the effects of the curse that had bound her to the armor. With the necromancy gem that commands life and death and the luck from the ring of abundant fortune, Angelica was able to recover the life force she had lost. In other words, Haruka brought this girl back to life, who decided to help him as a way of saying thank you. Speaking of which, wondering if he might be depriving her of a free existence, the lone wanderer asks why she doesn't just do what she wants now that she's out of the cave and doesn't need to stay by his side on this new journey. However, Angelica reacts by crying, shaking her head no, and embracing the boy. Haruka reflects that, having been alone for so long, it seems she needs to be by someone's side at the moment. To cheer up his guest, the homeowner tells a funny story until she falls asleep. A story of a lone wanderer who also knows what it's like to be alone in this world. The next morning, on day 43, Haruka calls his new friend for a 5-minute duel that won't harm their friendship because he needs to test the skills he gained in the dungeon but hasn't had the chance yet. With a smile, the girl accepts the invitation and the two square off. Haruka considers that his opponent has escaped the darkness of the dungeon, has probably evolved, and is even faster than before, but he promises to surpass this speed with his new shifting ability. As the fight begins, Angelica doesn't back down and swiftly advances with her sword aimed at her opponent. Haruka, testing his new technique, gains the reflexes necessary to dodge this and the next strikes by the warrior. Despite the success, Haruka knows he's still at a very low level, not to mention that, as everyone knows, he picked the worst skills in that white room. Still, despite the odds, the lone wanderer promises he will become strong. With that in mind, he attacks Angelica with his staff, but she defends and counters with a whack on the poor guy's head, ending the fight right there. Despite the beating, the boy is happy for having used his shifting for the first time in battle and promises that one day he will be stronger than Angelica, but not without first enjoying a good lunch. To prepare this meal, of course, it's necessary to gather the materials first, so Haruka uses his electric ability to catch some fish from the river and take them home. There, he teaches his friend how to use the knife to cut the fish, and the two bond even more until they finish a fish and mushroom meal that far exceeded the chef's expectations. After filling up, Haruka notices that Angelica looks apprehensive and flushed, so he asks what's going on. Without responding as usual, the girl makes an unexpected move by grabbing the boy by the arm and carrying him to bed. Once there, she asks him to sit beside her and circles around behind him, leaving him extremely nervous. Soon he discovers she wanted to give a massage to thank him for the meal, but despite having accepted the tempting offer, Haruka soon regrets it because the girl has a unique talent for missing all the right spots in the massage. Nevertheless, not wanting to make her sad, he endures the torture until the end and pretends he's feeling much better. Unsatisfied, Angelica wants to know what more she can do in return for everything the friend has been doing for her, so Haruka takes the friend outside. Outside the cave, a starry sky illustrated the beautiful landscape. Sitting on a bench, the two admired that wonderful view. Noticing that the girl seemed distant, Haruka tells her she can come closer if she wants. At the same time, he understands that all she knows might be war, so he intends to make an effort to teach her a thing or two that's not about that. With his hand, he strokes Angelica's head and thanks her for today. However, instead of a positive reaction, she becomes even shyer and turns her body away while trembling. Haruka touches her shoulder and says he understands what she's feeling. Inside, he recognizes that the girl is doing what she can to feel more normal and wants to help her with whatever he can. Soon, he invites Angelica to return to the city tomorrow, and she accepts. Then the two return to looking at the starry sky. On day 44, on the way to Omu, Haruka and Angelica feel the rain start to fall and quicken their pace to arrive soon. Inside the city walls, now without rain, the girls from the group notice the arrival of their friends and greet the two with joy. Furthermore, they look at the two with that "I know what you did" face. After all, they were simply holding hands. Finally, everyone chats with a new friend and feels happy for her return until the representative arrives and welcomes Angelica. Kazakazi gives Haruka a jiu-jitsu blow and teases the guy for having spent the night alone with the blonde, and soon all the boys gather around the lone wanderer to hear the details. After this warm reception, it's time for the embarrassed Angelica to return to Haruka's side. Imagining it was nothing serious, the boy asks her to mingle better with the people and turns around, but Angelica manages to ask him to wait using her voice, which makes Haruka stop immediately. With much effort, the warrior slowly thanks him for everything and returns to her friends. Alone, Haruka reflects on something he learned in this isekai. Everyone has their own problems, anxieties, and secrets. Sometimes everyone feels overwhelmed, trapped, and uncomfortable around people. In other words, deep down, everyone is lonely to some extent, but that doesn't mean they are on their own. And that's why Haruka will continue to explore this world, because even though he's known as the Lone Wanderer, he will never be alone on this journey.